Undercover Billionaire hides terminal diagnosis, but the nurse shows him real care changes everything. Before we begin this incredible journey of love, loss, and redemption, take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Whether you're in the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, or anywhere else in the world, we want this story to travel far and touch hearts everywhere. Now, let's dive in. The fluorescent lights of St. Catherine's Medical Center buzzed with their usual sterile hum, but nothing could have prepared anyone for the man who walked through those doors at 2:47 a.m. on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning. Not with his worn leather jacket, 3-day stubble, and eyes that carried the weight of secrets too heavy for one soul to bear alone. The emergency room intake desk sat beneath harsh lighting that made everyone look half dead, which was fitting, considering most people who came through those doors at this hour were halfway there already. Behind the desk, Nurse Imani Davis had seen it all in her 6 years at St. Catherine's. Overdoses and heart attacks, car wrecks and knife wounds, the desperate and the dying. But something about the man approaching her counter made her straighten in her chair, her pen hovering over the intake form. He moved like someone used to command, despite the obvious fatigue dragging at his shoulders. Tall, maybe 6'2", with dirty blonde hair that needed a cut and a jawline that would have been sharp if not for the gauntness hollowing his cheeks. His jeans were expensive, she'd learned to spot quality fabric in this job, but deliberately worn, and his boots had the kind of scuffs that came from actual work, not fashion. "Can I help you?" Imani asked, her voice carrying the practiced warmth she'd perfected over countless overnight shifts. It was a warmth that came naturally to her, even at 3 in the morning, even after 12 hours on her feet. The man's eyes met hers, and for a split second, she saw something flicker there. Surprise, maybe, or recognition of some unspoken thing. His eyes were gray, the color of storm clouds over Lake Michigan, and they held a depth that made her suddenly aware of her heartbeat. "I need to see a doctor," he said, his voice rough, like he'd been shouting or hadn't spoken in days. "Nothing urgent. Just, I need to see someone." Imani's trained gaze swept over him, looking for the telltale signs: bleeding, pallor, the glassy-eyed look of shock. He was pale, yes, and clearly exhausted, but there was no obvious trauma. Still, something in the set of his shoulders, the careful way he held himself, told her this man was in pain. "Okay," she said gently, pulling up a fresh form on her computer screen. "Let's start with your name." He hesitated. It was just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but Imani had learned to read people in this job. That hesitation meant something. "James," he said finally. "James Warren." "James Warren," she repeated, typing. "Address." Another pause. "I'm between places right now. Staying at the Northside Motor Lodge." The Northside Motor Lodge was the kind of place people stayed when they didn't want to be found, or when they couldn't afford anywhere better. Weekly rates, no questions asked, bedbugs included free of charge. Imani had seen enough patients list that address to know what it meant, usually. But this man, this James Warren, didn't fit the usual profile. There was something about him, something that didn't quite add up. The expensive watch he'd tried to hide under his sleeve. The way he held himself, despite the obvious exhaustion. The education in his diction, even rough as his voice was. "Insurance?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral. "I'll pay cash," he said quickly. Too quickly. Imani's fingers paused over the keyboard. Cash patients at 3 in the morning were rarely a good sign. She looked up at him again, really looked, and saw something in those gray eyes that made her chest tighten. Not danger, but desperation. The quiet kind that came from carrying too much alone for too long. "All right, Mr. Warren," she said softly. "Can you tell me what brings you in tonight? What symptoms are you experiencing?" James, if that was even his real name, pulled in a breath that seemed to hurt. "Headaches," he said. "Severe. Vision problems. Fatigue. Dizziness. It's been getting worse." Imani's clinical mind immediately started sorting through possibilities, none of them good. "How long have you been experiencing these symptoms?" 6 months, he said, and there was something in his voice. Resignation, maybe. Acceptance of something terrible. Maybe longer. 6 months. Vision problems. Severe headaches. The nurse in her wanted to fire off a dozen more questions, to start triage protocols, to get him back to a doctor immediately. But the woman in her, the part that had learned to see past symptoms to the souls carrying them, recognized something else entirely. This man had come here in the middle of the night not because his symptoms had suddenly worsened, but because he'd finally worked up the courage to face whatever he'd been running from. "Have you seen a doctor about this before?" she asked gently. His jaw tightened. "No. Mr. Warren." "James," he interrupted. "Just James." "James," she amended, her voice softening further. "These symptoms you're describing, they're serious. Why haven't you sought medical care before now?" For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. He looked away, toward the empty waiting room with its rows of plastic chairs and its year-old magazines, and when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I was afraid of what they'd tell me." The words hung in the sterile air between them, heavy with truth and terror. Imani felt something shift in her chest, that thing that happened sometimes in this job when you stopped seeing a patient as a case and started seeing them as a person, someone's son or brother or father, someone who laughed and dreamed and feared just like everyone else. "And now?" she asked quietly. James turned back to her, and she saw it then, clear as day. The exhaustion wasn't just physical. This man was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of carrying whatever burden he'd been shouldering alone. "Now I'm more afraid of not knowing," he said. Imani held his gaze for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, feeling something pass between them, some understanding that went beyond the usual patient-nurse dynamic. Then she nodded, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "Okay," she said. "Let's get you back to an exam room. Dr. Okonkwo is on tonight. She's brilliant, and she's kind. You're in good hands." She printed out his wristband and came around the desk to fasten it around his wrist. Her fingers brushed his skin, and she felt him flinch, not from pain, but from the touch itself, as if he wasn't used to gentleness. "This way," she said, leading him through the double doors into the treatment area. The ER was relatively quiet for a Tuesday night, a drunk sleeping it off in room 3, an elderly woman with pneumonia in room 5, a teenager who'd gotten in a fight waiting for x-rays in room 7. Imani guided James to room 9, the one at the end of the hall, the one that offered the most privacy. "Change into this gown," she said, handing him the folded blue fabric. "Opening in the back. Dr. Okonkwo will be in shortly, and I'll be back to get your vitals in just a moment." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Thank you," he said, and there was something in those two words, genuine gratitude, the kind that came from someone who hadn't expected kindness and was overwhelmed by receiving it. Imani smiled, the real smile that transformed her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. "That's what I'm here for, James. You don't have to thank me for doing my job." "Still," he said quietly. "Thank you." 20 minutes later, Imani returned to find James sitting on the edge of the exam table in the hospital gown, his clothes folded neatly on the chair beside him. He looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable without the armor of his jacket and boots. His arms were muscled but lean, and she could see the sharp cut of his collarbones above the gown's neckline. He'd lost weight, probably more than he should have. "All right," she said, rolling her vitals cart closer. "Let's see what we're working with." She wrapped the blood pressure cuff around his arm, her fingers gentle but efficient. As the cuff inflated, she watched his face, noting the tight lines around his eyes, the way he held his jaw like someone bracing for pain. "Blood pressure's a bit elevated," she said, noting the numbers. 147/92. "Are you on any medications currently?" "No," he said. "Any history of high blood pressure? Heart disease? Diabetes?" "No. Nothing." She moved on to his temperature, slipping the thermometer under his tongue. While they waited for it to beep, she studied him more carefully. There were details she'd missed in the harsh light of the intake desk, the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the calluses on his hands despite their overall elegance, the way his fingers trembled slightly when he thought she wasn't looking. The thermometer beeped. Temperatures normal. 98.4. She wrapped the pulse oximeter around his finger. How's your appetite been? Not great, he admitted. Everything tastes like cardboard lately. Are you eating anyway? A slight smile tugged at his lips, transforming his face for just a moment. When I remember to. Pulse ox is good. 98%. She made notes on her tablet, then looked up at him. The headaches, can you describe them for me? Where do you feel them? How severe? James touched the back of his head, just at the base of his skull. Here, mostly. Sometimes it radiates forward, behind my eyes. On a scale of 1 to 10, they're usually around a 7. Sometimes worse. What makes them better or worse? Light makes them worse. Noise. Movement. He paused. Nothing really makes them better. Ibuprofen barely touches them anymore. Imani's clinical concern deepened, but she kept her expression neutral. And the vision problems, what kind of issues are you having? Blurriness. Double vision sometimes. There are blind spots. They come and go. Red flags were waving frantically in Imani's mind, but she maintained her calm demeanor. Have you experienced any nausea? Vomiting? Seizures? Nausea, yes. No seizures. He met her eyes. But I've been having trouble with my balance. And my coordination has been off. How off? He looked down at his hands. I dropped my coffee cup this morning. My hand stopped working for a second. Imani set down her tablet and pulled up the rolling stool, sitting so she was at eye level with him. This wasn't standard procedure. She should finish her assessment and get Dr. Okonkwo, but something in his voice, in the way he was looking at those traitorous hands, made her pause. James, she said softly. You know these symptoms are serious, don't you? He nodded slowly. I've suspected for a while. Then why? She stopped herself, recognizing the futility of the question. She'd asked it already, and besides, she thought she understood. What made you come in tonight? What changed? For a long moment, he didn't answer. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped steadily. Finally, James looked up at her, and the vulnerability in his eyes nearly broke her heart. I was sitting in that motel room, he said quietly, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, and I realized that if I died there, alone, no one would know. No one would care. And I thought, that's not how I want this to end. Whatever this is, whatever's happening to me, I don't want to face it alone in the dark. The words settled between them like stones dropping into still water, creating ripples that spread out and out. Imani felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. How many times had she seen this? People waiting too long, hiding too much, suffering alone because they were afraid or ashamed or just too tired to ask for help. But something about James was different. Despite the expensive watch and the careful evasions, despite whatever he was hiding about who he really was, there was a raw honesty in his words that cut straight through her professional detachment. You're not alone now, she said, and meant it more than she probably should have. James's eyes searched hers, looking for something, sincerity, maybe, or hope. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him because some of the tension drained from his shoulders. I'll get Dr. Okonkwo, Imani said, standing. But James? Whatever this is, whatever we find, we're going to face it together. That's what we do here. You're not alone anymore. She left before he could respond, but not before she saw the way his eyes glistened, just slightly, in the harsh fluorescent light. Dr. Adana Okonkwo was everything Imani had promised, brilliant and kind, with a no-nonsense manner that somehow managed to be comforting rather than cold. She was in her late 40s, with silver streaking through her black hair, and the kind of steady hands that came from 30 years of medicine. Imani stood in the corner of the exam room, taking notes as Dr. Okonkwo conducted her examination. She watched as the doctor checked James's pupils, tested his reflexes, had him follow her finger with his eyes. She saw the concern that flickered across Dr. Okonkwo's face, quickly masked but unmistakable. "Mr. Warren," Dr. Okonkwo said, "I'm going to be direct with you because I think you'd prefer honesty. Based on your symptoms and my preliminary examination, I'm very concerned. The combination of severe headaches, vision problems, coordination issues, and the location you've described suggests a possible neurological issue. I want to order an MRI immediately." James nodded, his face pale but composed. "Okay. Can I ask, have you been avoiding medical care deliberately? Because these symptoms have been present for 6 months, and that's a significant delay." "I have," James admitted. "And I know that was stupid. I had my reasons." "Reasons we don't need to discuss right now," Dr. Okonkwo said gently. "What matters is that you're here now, and we're going to figure out what's going on. The MRI will give us detailed images of your brain and help us determine what we're dealing with." "And if it's what I think it is?" James asked quietly. Dr. Okonkwo met his eyes steadily. "Then we'll deal with that when we know for sure. One step at a time, Mr. Warren. First, let's get the images." After Dr. Okonkwo left to order the scan, Imani approached the exam table again. James was sitting with his head in his hands, his shoulders curved inward like he was trying to make himself smaller. "Hey," she said softly. "You okay?" He looked up, and she was struck again by those gray eyes, by the intelligence and fear and something else she couldn't quite name that swirled in their depths. "Define okay," he said with a weak attempt at humor. "Fair point." She leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely. "The MRI can take a while to schedule, even for urgent cases. It might be a few hours before they can get you in. Are you hungry? I could grab you something from the vending machine." "I don't think I could eat," he said. Then, after a pause, "But thank you for asking." They sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that somehow felt less empty than it should have. Finally, James spoke again. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why are you being so kind to me? I mean, I know it's your job, but this." He gestured vaguely between them. "This feels different." Imani considered the question, surprised by its directness. Why was she being different with him? She was kind to all her patients, that wasn't unusual. But James was right, there was something different here, some connection she couldn't quite explain. "I think," she said slowly, "because I can see you're scared, and trying really hard not to show it. And I guess I just want you to know that you don't have to pretend here. You don't have to be strong or brave or anything other than exactly what you are right now." James's expression shifted, something cracking in that carefully maintained facade. "And what am I right now?" "Human," Imani said simply. "Scared and brave all at once. Just like the rest of us. What would you do if you had to face your biggest fear alone? Have you ever hidden something because you were afraid of the truth? Drop a comment below, we'd love to hear your thoughts." The MRI wouldn't be available until 6 a.m., a little over 3 hours away. Dr. Okonkwo had ordered pain medication for James's headache and suggested he try to rest while they waited. Imani had settled him back in room 9 with the lights dimmed and the door partially closed, creating a small island of relative peace in the bustling ER. She should have moved on to her other patients. Mrs. Henderson in room 5 needed her 4 antibiotics, and the kid in room 7 was probably getting antsy waiting for those X-ray results. But she found herself checking on James more frequently than strictly necessary, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. At 4:30 a.m., she found him awake, staring at the ceiling with those storm cloud eyes. "Can't sleep?" she asked from the doorway. "Didn't really expect to," he admitted. "Mine's too loud." Imani glanced down the hallway, quiet for the moment, then made a decision. She stepped into the room and pulled up the chair beside his bed. "Want to talk about it?" she offered. Sometimes talking helps quiet the noise. James turned his head to look at her, surprise evident on his face. "Don't you have other patients?" "I do," she acknowledged. "But they're all stable right now, and you look like you could use someone to talk to. So, here I am." If you want. For a moment, she thought he'd refuse. Then he shifted slightly, making room for the conversation between them. I keep thinking, he said quietly, about all the time I've wasted, the things I should have done differently, the people I should have been kinder to, the life I should have lived. That's pretty heavy thinking for 4:30 in the morning, Imani said gently. Yeah, well, when you're possibly facing a terminal diagnosis, you tend to get philosophical. The word terminal hung in the air between them, sharp and cold. Imani wanted to reassure him, to tell him not to jump to conclusions, but she'd been a nurse long enough to know that false hope was sometimes crueler than honest fear. Tell me something, she said instead. If you could do anything differently, what would it be? James was quiet for a long time, his eyes back on the ceiling. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. I'd be more honest, he said, about who I am, what I want, what I need. I've spent so long hiding behind masks and walls and lies. And for what? To protect myself. To maintain some illusion of control. He laughed bitterly. Lot of good it did me. Imani found herself leaning forward, drawn in by the raw honesty in his words. It's not too late, you know. To be honest. To be yourself. Isn't it? He turned to look at her again. What if the MRI shows what I think it shows? What if I've wasted all this time, and now there's no time left? Then you use whatever time you have, Imani said firmly. You stop hiding. You stop running. You live honestly for as long as you can. It's not about the quantity of time, James. It's about the quality. About being real. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in that armor he wore, letting a sliver of light through. You make it sound so simple. Simple doesn't mean easy, she said. But it is a choice. Every moment is a choice. James studied her face, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. Who are you, Imani Davis? Really? The question surprised her. What do you mean? I mean, you're here at 4:30 in the morning, sitting with a stranger who lied about his name, who's probably dying, who has absolutely nothing to offer you. Why? Because you're not nothing, Imani said immediately. You're a human being who's scared and hurting, and that matters. You matter. You don't even know me. I know enough, she said. I know you came here alone in the middle of the night because you finally found the courage to stop running. I know you've been in pain for months but tried to bear it silently. I know you're scared but trying to be brave. And I know that right now, in this moment, you need someone to see you, really see you, and tell you that you're not alone. James's eyes glistened, and he blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. I don't deserve your kindness. Everyone deserves kindness, Imani said softly. Especially when they think they don't. The moment stretched between them, fragile and profound. Then James did something unexpected. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was gentle but desperate, like a drowning man grasping for a lifeline. Thank you, he whispered. Imani squeezed his hand back, feeling the tremor in his fingers, the fear and gratitude and hope all mixed together. You're welcome. They sat like that for several minutes, hands clasped in the dim light of the hospital room, two strangers finding an unexpected connection in the darkest hours of the night. Finally, Imani glanced at her watch and sighed. I should check on my other patients, she said reluctantly. I know. But he didn't let go of her hand immediately. I'll be back to check on you before you go to radiology, she promised. Okay. He released her hand slowly, his fingers trailing across her palm. Imani. Yeah. Whatever they find, would you be there? When they tell me. The request was so vulnerable, so raw, that Imani felt her heart clench. This man who she'd known for barely 2 hours was asking her to stand beside him for potentially the worst news of his life. Yes, she said without hesitation. I'll be there. I promise. The night shift was ending when they finally wheeled James to radiology at 6 a.m. Imani had stayed past the end of her shift, telling herself it was just to see him through the MRI, to keep her promise. But as she watched him disappear through the radiology doors, she knew it was more than that. Something had shifted in those quiet hours of the night, in those stolen conversations and held hands and shared vulnerabilities. She'd seen beneath James Warren's mask, or whatever his real name was, and found a soul worth knowing. A man worth caring about. And now, as dawn broke over Chicago and the day shift nurses began arriving, Imani made a decision. She wasn't leaving. Not until she knew. Not until she was there for him, just like she'd promised. Because sometimes, in the sterile halls of a hospital, in the darkest hours before dawn, strangers became something more. And sometimes, just sometimes, showing up for another human being, really showing up, mattered more than anything else in the world. James Warren, whoever he really was, wouldn't face his diagnosis alone. Imani Davis would make sure of that. The MRI suite hummed with the kind of mechanical precision that James had once found comforting. In his old life, his real life, he'd been surrounded by the hum of technology, the click of keyboards, the soft whir of servers processing millions of transactions. But this machine wasn't processing stock trades or cryptocurrency exchanges. It was processing images of his brain, mapping the geography of whatever was slowly killing him. Through the observation window, he could see the technician's face, professionally blank as she monitored the screens. Somewhere beyond that room, Imani was waiting. The thought of her steadied him more than it should have. More than made sense given they'd only just met. The machine clicked and whirred around him, and James closed his eyes, trying not to think about what it might find. Instead, he thought about the woman who'd held his hand in the dark, who'd promised to stay, who'd looked at him like he was worth saving even when he'd given her every reason to walk away. He'd told her his name was James Warren. It wasn't entirely a lie. James was his middle name, and Warren had been his mother's maiden name. But his real name, the one that appeared on Forbes' billionaire list and in Wall Street Journal headlines, was something else entirely. Christopher James Bennett. CEO of Bennett Technologies. Net worth, $4.7 billion, give or take a few $100 million depending on the market. And none of it mattered now. Not the money, not the power, not the empire he'd built from nothing. Because what good was wealth when you couldn't buy more time? What good was power when your own body betrayed you? Dr. Okonkwo's office was small but neat, with diplomas lining one wall and family photos on her desk. Imani sat beside James in the chair across from the doctor. Her scrubs rumpled from the long night, but her presence solid and reassuring. She'd kept her promise. She was here. Dr. Okonkwo's face was grave as she pulled up the MRI images on her computer screen. James felt his heart hammering against his ribs, each beat a countdown to a truth he'd been avoiding for 6 months. Mr. Warren, Dr. Okonkwo began, then paused, her eyes moving between James and Imani. I'm going to be direct because I believe you'd want that. The MRI shows a mass in your brain, specifically, in the posterior fossa region, which explains your symptoms. Based on the location, size, and appearance, my preliminary assessment is that this is a glioblastoma. The word landed like a bomb in the small office. James heard it, understood it, and felt something inside him simply stop. Not his heart, that kept beating, traitorous and insistent, but something else. Some last fragment of hope he'd been clinging to. Glioblastoma, he repeated, his voice hollow. That's brain cancer. Yes, Dr. Okonkwo said gently. It's an aggressive form, I'm afraid. We'll need to do a biopsy to confirm, but based on what I'm seeing here. How long? James interrupted. He needed to know. Needed to hear the number that would define the rest of his life. Dr. Okonkwo's expression softened with compassion. Without treatment, typically 12 to 18 months from onset of symptoms. You said yours began 6 months ago. Maybe longer, James said distantly. I wasn't paying attention at first. Beside him, Imani had gone very still. He could feel her presence like a warm current, anchoring him when everything else felt like it was spinning away. And with treatment? Imani asked, her voice steady despite the emotion James could hear beneath it. Treatment can extend that timeline, Dr. Okonkwo said carefully. Surgery to remove as much of the tumor as possible, followed by radiation and chemotherapy. But I need to be honest, glioblastoma is extremely difficult to treat. The 5-year survival rate is approximately 5%. 5%. James let that sink in. In his business, 5% was a rounding error. In his life, it was everything. I'd like to refer you to Dr. Morrison at Northwestern, Dr. Okonkwo continued. He's one of the best neurosurgeons in the country. We'll need to move quickly. This tumor is in a challenging location, and given its size, I'd recommend surgery as soon as possible. James nodded mechanically, barely hearing the rest of Dr. Okonkwo's words as she discussed treatment options, support resources, the importance of getting his affairs in order. Get his affairs in order. As if his affairs weren't already meticulously ordered, managed by a team of lawyers and accountants who had no idea their CEO was dying. Mr. Warren. Dr. Okonkwo's voice broke through his thoughts. Do you have any questions? He had a million questions. He had no questions. What was there to ask when the answer was always the same? You're dying, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop it. No, he said finally. Thank you for being honest. I wish I had better news to give you. Dr. Okonkwo stood, signaling the end of the consultation. My nurse will get you the referral information and help coordinate with Dr. Morrison's office. And Mr. Warren? I know this is devastating news, but there is still hope. Medicine is advancing every day, and... I understand, James cut her off gently. He couldn't hear about hope right now. Hope felt like a cruelty. After Dr. Okonkwo left, James and Imani sat in silence. The morning sun was streaming through the office window now, painting everything in shades of gold that felt obscene given the darkness of the news they'd just received. James, Imani said softly. He couldn't look at her. If he looked at her, if he saw pity or sadness or any of the things people felt when they learned someone was dying, he thought he might shatter completely. I need some air, he said, standing abruptly. I just need. Okay, Imani said, rising with him. Let me walk you out. You don't have to. I know, she said firmly. I'm doing it anyway. They walked through the hospital corridors in silence, past the morning shift change chaos, past patients and visitors and doctors making their rounds. The world kept spinning, James realized. His world had just ended, but everyone else's kept going like nothing had changed at all. Outside, the Chicago morning was crisp and bright, the kind of October day that made you believe in new beginnings. James breathed in the cool air, trying to steady himself, trying to process the fact that he might not see many more mornings like this. Where are you going now? Imani asked. Back to his motel room. Back to the water-stained ceiling, and the thin walls, and the anonymity he'd been hiding in for the past 2 weeks. He'd left everything behind, his penthouse, his office, his life, trying to escape the truth. And the truth had found him, anyway. I don't know, he admitted. Imani was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was careful. Can I ask you something? And will you be honest with me? I can try. James Warren isn't your real name, is it? He should have been surprised, but somehow he wasn't. Imani saw too much, understood too much. No, he said quietly. It's not. Are you in some kind of trouble? Running from something. Not trouble, he said. Not the legal kind, anyway. I was trying to be someone else for a while. Someone who wasn't. He stopped, unsure how to explain. Someone who wasn't dying. Imani finished gently. Someone who wasn't defined by what I have, James said. Or what I'm losing. Imani stepped closer, and he could smell the faint scent of her perfume mixed with hospital antiseptic. Who are you really? She asked. This was it. The moment of truth. He could keep lying, keep hiding behind James Warren and let her think he was just some nobody dying alone in a cheap motel. Or he could do what he'd told her he wished he'd done more of, be honest. Christopher Bennett, he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue after weeks of avoiding it. My name is Christopher James Bennett. He watched her face, waiting for recognition. In his world, everyone knew that name. Bennett Technologies. The boy genius who'd turned a college startup into a tech empire. The billionaire who dated models and bought islands and appeared in tabloids as often as business journals. But Imani just looked at him, her expression thoughtful. Should I know that name? Despite everything, James felt a laugh bubble up in his chest. Probably not. I mean, maybe. I run a tech company. It's fairly large. How large? Large enough that if people knew I was sick, the stock price would tank. Large enough that I have lawyers and PR teams whose entire job is managing my image. Large enough that I couldn't be dying in public, so I decided to try being dying in private instead. Imani's eyes widened slightly as understanding dawned. You're hiding from your own life. I was trying to, he admitted. Trying to figure out how to face this without the whole world watching. Trying to be just me. Not Christopher Bennett, tech billionaire. Not the face of a company. Just a guy who's scared and doesn't know how to fix what's broken. So you checked into a cheap motel and pretended to be someone else. It sounds pathetic when you say it like that. It sounds human, Imani said softly. She reached out and took his hand, the same way she had in the hospital room. Christopher. Is that what you want me to call you? Chris, he said. My mom used to call me Chris. Before she died. Before all of this. He gestured vaguely, encompassing his empire, his wealth, his carefully constructed life. Chris, Imani repeated, testing the name. Okay, Chris. Here's what I think you should do. I think you should stop hiding. Not from the world necessarily, but from yourself. Because you just got some terrible news, and you're going to need support to get through it. Real support. Not fake names in fake motels, but actual people who care about you. I don't have people, Chris said quietly. Not real ones. I have employees and board members and people who want things from me. But actual people who care. Those are in pretty short supply. You have me, Imani said simply. Chris stared at her. You don't even know me. I know enough. I know you're scared and trying to be brave. I know you've been in pain for months and bore it alone. I know you're honest about the things that matter, even when lying would be easier. And I know that whatever comes next, you shouldn't face it alone. Why? Chris asked, genuinely bewildered. Why would you do this? Why would you care about some random stranger who lied to you? Imani smiled, and it transformed her entire face. The exhaustion from her double shift, the worry from the diagnosis, all of it falling away for just a moment. Because 6 years ago, I was in nursing school, working 3 jobs to pay for it, and I got pneumonia. I was too stubborn to go to the hospital because I couldn't afford it. And one night, I collapsed at my waitressing job, and one of the customers, this sweet old lady I'd never met before, she rode with me in the ambulance. She stayed with me all night. Held my hand. Made sure I wasn't alone. She squeezed Chris's hand gently. I asked her why, and you know what she said? She said, because nobody should face the scary things alone, honey. Nobody. So that's what I'm doing. I'm being the person who stays. Because you shouldn't face this alone, Chris. Nobody should. Chris felt something crack inside him, some dam he'd built to hold back the fear and grief and overwhelming terror of the past 6 months. Tears spilled down his cheeks before he could stop them, and then Imani's arms were around him, holding him steady while he shook with silent sobs in a hospital parking lot as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. I'm scared, he whispered against her shoulder. I know, she murmured. I know you are. But you're not alone anymore. I've got you. And in that moment, surrounded by the smell of hospital antiseptic and autumn air, held by a woman he'd known for less than 12 hours, Christopher James Bennett felt something he hadn't felt in years, seen. Truly, completely seen. Not as a billionaire or a CEO or a headline. Just as a man who was scared and broken and desperately in need of someone to care. They sat on a bench outside the hospital, neither quite ready to leave. Chris had stopped crying, but he felt raw and exposed, like he'd shed a layer of skin and everything was too bright, too sharp. "Tell me about your company," Imani said. "Bennett Technologies. What do you do?" Chris huffed a laugh. "Are you actually interested, or are you just trying to distract me?" "Can't it be both?" He found himself smiling despite everything. "We do a lot of things. Started with cloud computing infrastructure, expanded into AI, machine learning, cybersecurity. We have our hands in pretty much every emerging tech sector." "And you built this yourself?" "From my dorm room at MIT, he confirmed. "I was 20 years old, too arrogant to know it was impossible, and somehow I made it work. 15 years later, we're worth about $40 billion. Imani whistled softly. "That's a lot of zeros." "It is. And none of it can buy you more time." The words could have been cruel, but coming from Imani, they were simply honest. Chris appreciated that. The lack of platitudes, the willingness to name the terrible truth between them. "No," he agreed. "None of it can buy me more time." That's a humbling realization for someone who's spent his entire adult life believing money could solve any problem. "Is that why you left? Why you're hiding as James Warren?" Chris leaned back against the bench, tilting his face toward the sun. "About 2 months ago, I was in a board meeting. We were discussing Q3 projections, and suddenly I couldn't see the presentation. Everything went double, and the headache was so bad I thought I might pass out right there. But I pushed through it because that's what I do. I push through." After the meeting, my assistant asked if I was okay, and I snapped at her. Told her to mind her own business. He paused, remembering the hurt in Jennifer's eyes. She'd been with him for 7 years, and he'd never spoken to her like that before. "I went home that night," he continued, "and I looked around my penthouse, 12,000 square feet overlooking Lake Michigan, worth $30 million, and I realized I was completely alone. No family. No real friends. Just employees and board members and people who smiled at me because I signed their paychecks. And I thought, if I died tomorrow, who would actually care? Who would mourn me, not the company or the money, but me?" "And you couldn't think of anyone," Imani said quietly. "No," Chris admitted. "I couldn't. So I started thinking about what that meant. About how I'd built this incredible empire but somehow forgotten to build a life. And when the symptoms kept getting worse, when I couldn't ignore them anymore, I realized I didn't want to face dying as Christopher Bennett. I wanted to face it as just a person. Someone normal. Someone who could go to a hospital at 3 in the morning and just be scared without it becoming a media circus." "So you became James Warren." "So I became James Warren. Checked into the Northside Motor Lodge, paid cash for a month, and tried to figure out how to die like a normal person." Imani was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I think you're going about this wrong." "Oh." Chris raised an eyebrow. "You don't need to become someone else to be human, Chris. You already are human. The money doesn't change that. The company doesn't change that. Being scared and sick and mortal, that's the most human thing there is." "But everyone wants something from me," Chris protested. "If I go back to being Christopher Bennett, if people know I'm sick, it'll be a feeding frenzy. The board will try to push me out. Shareholders will panic. Competitors will circle like sharks. And the media, God, the media will turn my death into a spectacle." "Maybe," Imani acknowledged. "Or maybe you're not giving people enough credit. Maybe there are people in your life who would actually care, who would want to support you, if you gave them the chance." "I don't think there are." "Then find them. Build them. You built a billion-dollar company from nothing. You can build a support system too. It's not too late, Chris. It's never too late." Chris wanted to believe her. Wanted to think that he could go back to his real life and find genuine connection there. But 15 years of carefully constructed walls, of keeping people at arm's length, of trusting no one, that didn't just disappear because you got a terminal diagnosis. I don't know how, he admitted. I don't know how to let people in. Imani took his hand again, her fingers warm and steady. You start small. One person at a time. You already started with me. You're different. Why? Because I'm not impressed by your money? Because I don't want anything from you. Yes, Chris said simply. Because you see me. Not Christopher Bennett, tech billionaire. Just me. Then maybe that's what you need to find, Imani said. Other people who can see you that way. Or maybe you need to give the people already in your life a chance to surprise you. But Chris, you can't keep hiding. You can't die as James Warren in a motel room with water-stained ceilings. That's not dignity, that's just another kind of prison. She was right. Chris knew she was right. But knowing something intellectually and having the courage to act on it were two very different things. Will you help me? He asked quietly. I don't know how to do this. How to be sick. How to be vulnerable. How to let people see me like this. Of course I'll help you, Imani said without hesitation. That's what I've been trying to tell you. You're not alone in this. You have your own life. Your job. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. She checked her phone and grimaced. Speaking of my job, I should probably go home and get some actual sleep. I worked a double, and I'm back on tonight. Chris felt a sudden panic at the thought of her leaving, of being alone again with his diagnosis and his fear. But he had no right to ask her to stay, no claim on her time or care beyond what she'd already freely given. Thank you, he said. For everything. For staying. For being there when Dr. Okonkwo told me. For not running away when I told you who I really am. Chris, Imani said seriously, I'm not going anywhere. Do you understand that? Whatever comes next, the appointments, the treatment, all of it, you don't have to do it alone. I meant what I said. Why? Chris asked again, still unable to fully grasp why this woman would care about him. Imani smiled softly. Because sometimes, the universe puts people in your path at exactly the right moment. And I think maybe we were supposed to meet last night. I think maybe you were supposed to walk into my ER, and I was supposed to be there. Call it fate or chance or just dumb luck, but here we are. And I'm not walking away from that. Chris felt his throat tighten again. I don't deserve you. Stop saying things like that, Imani said firmly. You deserve care and kindness just like everyone else. Your worth isn't determined by what you can give or what you've accomplished. You matter because you're human. That's enough. She stood, shouldering her bag. Get some rest. Real rest, in a real bed. Not that motel. Do you have anywhere else you can stay? Chris thought of his penthouse, sitting empty across town. He hadn't been there in 2 weeks. I have a place. I've been avoiding it. Stop avoiding. Go home. Take a shower. Eat something. And Chris. Call someone. Anyone. Your assistant, a business partner, whoever. You need to start letting people know what's happening. You need to start building that support system. What if no one cares? Then you'll find people who do, Imani said simply. She pulled out her phone. Give me your number. Your real number. Chris rattled off his personal cell, the one only a handful of people had. Imani typed it in and called him, letting it ring once so he'd have hers too. There, she said. Now we can reach each other. I'm working tonight from 7 to 7, but text me if you need anything. Seriously. Anything. You need to sleep. I'll sleep. But Chris, promise me, if you need someone to talk to, if it gets too dark in your head, you'll reach out. Promise me. I promise, Chris said and meant it. Imani studied his face for a long moment, then nodded, satisfied. Okay. I'll check in on you later. Go home, Chris. Stop hiding. He watched her walk away, her scrubs wrinkled from the long night, her steps slightly unsteady from exhaustion. She was remarkable, he realized. This woman who barely knew him but had stayed anyway, who'd held his hand through the worst news of his life, who'd somehow seen past every wall he'd built and found something worth caring about underneath. And for the first time since those terrible words, glioblastoma, 12 to 18 months, 5% survival rate, Chris felt something other than despair. He felt hope. Maybe not for a cure. Maybe not for survival. But hope that however much time he had left, he wouldn't have to face it alone. The penthouse was exactly as Chris had left it 2 weeks ago. Immaculate, expensive, and utterly lifeless. He stood in the marble foyer, his duffel bag from the motel hanging heavy in his hand, and felt like a stranger in his own home. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Lake Michigan, the afternoon sun turning the water into a sheet of hammered gold. Minimalist furniture in shades of gray and white. Abstract art on the walls, each piece worth more than most people made in a year. A kitchen with top-of-the-line appliances he rarely used because he ate most of his meals at the office or had them delivered. It was beautiful. It was cold. It was everything he'd worked for and nothing he needed. Chris dropped his bag by the door and walked to the windows, pressing his palm against the glass. Somewhere out there, Imani was driving home to her own place, probably a modest apartment she could afford on a nurse's salary. She'd go to sleep in a bed that didn't cost thousands of dollars, surrounded by things that actually meant something to her. And tonight, she'd go back to work, back to caring for strangers who needed her. She'd stayed for him. Through the diagnosis, through his tears, through the revelation of who he really was. She'd stayed. Chris pulled out his phone, staring at the contact he'd saved simply as Imani. His thumb hovered over her name, wanting to text her, to hear her voice, to not be alone in this expensive tomb. But she needed sleep. She'd worked a double shift for him, stayed hours past her shift end. He couldn't be that selfish. Instead, he scrolled through his other contacts. Hundreds of names, business associates, board members, lawyers, accountants. People who knew Christopher Bennett, CEO. People who'd want to know about his diagnosis for purely strategic reasons. His finger stopped on one name, Jennifer Park. His executive assistant for 7 years. The woman he'd snapped at in that meeting 2 months ago, whose feelings he'd hurt because he was too proud to admit he was in pain. Before he could overthink it, Chris hit call. She answered on the second ring. Mr. Bennett. Her voice was professionally warm but cautious. I wasn't expecting to hear from you. Are you? Is everything all right? Chris realized he hadn't contacted anyone from his company in 2 weeks. He'd simply disappeared without explanation, leaving Jennifer and his entire executive team to manage things without him. They must have been panicking. Jennifer, he said, his voice rough. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for disappearing. I'm sorry for how I spoke to you. I'm sorry for, his voice cracked, and he had to stop. Mr. Bennett. Now Jennifer's voice was genuinely concerned. What's wrong? Where are you? I'm home. At the penthouse. Jennifer, I need to tell you something, and it's not good news. There was a pause, and Chris could picture her, efficient, organized Jennifer in her neat suits, already pulling up her calendar to clear his schedule, to manage whatever crisis was coming. I'm listening, she said quietly. Chris took a breath and did what he'd been avoiding for 6 months. He told the truth. I have brain cancer, he said. Glioblastoma. I found out this morning. I've been sick for months, but I didn't want to face it. I've been hiding, Jennifer. From everyone. From everything. But I can't hide anymore. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Chris wondered if the call had dropped. Then he heard it, a soft, choked sound that might have been a sob. Oh, Chris, Jennifer said, and he realized it was the first time in 7 years she'd called him by his first name. Oh my God. I'm so sorry. How bad is it? Bad, he admitted. 12 to 18 months, maybe less. 5% survival rate. They want to do surgery, but even that's just buying time. What do you need? Jennifer asked immediately, her voice steadying as she shifted into problem-solving mode. What can I do? Chris felt something warm unfurl in his chest. She hadn't asked about the company. Hadn't mentioned the stock price or board meetings or succession planning. Her first instinct had been to ask what he needed. I don't know, he said honestly. I don't know how to do this, Jennifer. I've spent 15 years building a company, but I don't know how to face dying. Then we'll figure it out together, she said firmly. You're not doing this alone, Chris. Do you hear me? Whatever you need, appointments, treatment, someone to drive you, someone to sit with you. I'm here. Not as your assistant. As your friend. Chris felt his eyes burn with tears for the second time that day. I didn't think I had friends. Well, you do, Jennifer said, and there was a fierceness in her voice that surprised him. You have me. And Chris, there are others too. Marcus from IT talks about you like you walk on water because you spent 3 hours helping him debug code when you could have just fired him. Keisha in marketing says you're the only CEO she's ever had who actually listened to her ideas. Tom in legal, do you remember when his daughter was sick last year? He needed time off, Chris said vaguely. You gave him 6 weeks of paid leave and personally covered her medical bills, Jennifer said. He tries not to cry every time your name comes up. Chris, you're not as alone as you think you are. You've just been too busy building walls to notice the people trying to climb them. Chris sank onto the leather sofa, phone pressed to his ear, and let Jennifer's words wash over him. Maybe Imani had been right. Maybe there were people who cared about him, not just his money or his company, but him. The board needs to know, he said eventually. And shareholders. We need to. No, Jennifer interrupted. Not yet. Not until you're ready. The company can survive without immediate disclosure. What matters right now is you. Your health. Your treatment. Everything else can wait. That's not very corporate of you, Jennifer. I don't care, she said bluntly. You matter more than corporate protocol. Now, tell me about treatment. What did the doctors say? Chris explained everything Dr. Okonkwo had told him, the tumor's location, the recommended surgery, the follow-up treatment. Jennifer listened, asking questions, taking notes. He could hear the click of her keyboard in the background, and he knew she was already researching, already planning, already trying to help in the only way she knew how. I'm going to call Dr. Morrison's office and get you an appointment as soon as possible, she said. And Chris, I'm coming over. You shouldn't be alone right now. You don't have to. I'm coming over, she repeated, brooking no argument. I'll bring food. Real food, not whatever sad takeout you were planning to order. Give me an hour. After she hung up, Chris sat in the silence of his penthouse and felt something shift. The walls he'd built so carefully, the isolation he'd maintained so meticulously, maybe they weren't as necessary as he'd thought. Maybe letting people in wasn't weakness. Maybe it was the bravest thing he could do. His phone buzzed with a text. Imani. Home safe. About to sleep. How are you doing? Chris smiled, his fingers moving across the screen. Took your advice. Called someone. You were right, I wasn't as alone as I thought. Her response came quickly. Proud of you. That took courage. Now rest. We'll talk later. You've got this. The heart emoji shouldn't have meant as much as it did. But Chris found himself staring at it, at that small digital symbol of care and affection, and feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Connected. Seen. Less alone. Jennifer arrived exactly 1 hour later with enough food to feed 6 people and a determination in her eyes that Chris recognized. She was on a mission, and nothing would stop her. You look terrible, she said, setting bags of Thai food on his kitchen counter. Thanks, Chris said dryly. You really know how to cheer a guy up. I'm serious, Chris. When's the last time you ate? Or slept? I slept a few hours at the motel yesterday. Ate, sometime. Jennifer shook her head, pulling containers from the bags. Okay, New rule. You're eating actual meals at actual times. None of this, sometime, nonsense. Your body is about to go through hell with treatment. You need to be as strong as possible. She'd changed out of her work clothes into jeans and a northwestern sweatshirt, her black hair pulled back in a ponytail. Without her usual professional armor, she looked younger, more vulnerable. Chris realized he knew almost nothing about her personal life despite seeing her every day for 7 years. "Jennifer," he said as she plated food. "I'm sorry. For how I've been. For keeping you at arm's length. For treating you like just an assistant when you've been," he paused, searching for the right words. "When you've been so much more than that." Jennifer's hands stilled over the pad thai. "You scared me, you know. When you disappeared without a word. I thought maybe. I don't know what I thought. That you'd been in an accident. That something terrible had happened. Which I guess it had, just not the way I imagined. I should have told you sooner. Told someone." "Yeah, you should have," she agreed, carrying plates to the dining table. "But you're telling people now. That's what matters." They ate in companionable silence for a while, Chris surprised to find he actually had an appetite. The food was good, and having another person in the cavernous penthouse made it feel less like a mausoleum. "Tell me about her," Jennifer said suddenly. Chris looked up. "Who?" "The woman who convinced you to stop hiding. The one who made you call me. I can see it in your face, Chris. Something changed. Someone changed you." Chris felt heat rise in his cheeks. When was the last time he'd blushed? "Her name is Imani. She's a nurse at St. Catherine's. I met her last night when I finally went to the ER. And she stayed with me. Through the diagnosis. Through everything. She barely knows me, but she—" He trailed off, unsure how to explain what Imani had done, what she'd meant to him in such a short time. "She saw you," Jennifer said softly. "The real you, not the CEO version." "Yes," Chris said, grateful she understood. "Exactly that." Jennifer smiled. "Good. You need more people like that in your life. People who see Chris, not Christopher Bennett." "I told her who I really am today. I thought she'd, I don't know, treat me differently. But she didn't. She just kept being herself." "Sounds like a keeper," Jennifer said. "Are you going to see her again?" "She's working tonight. She told me to text her if I needed anything." "Then text her. Tell her you're home. That you're eating. That you took her advice." Jennifer pointed her fork at him. "And Chris, don't let this one slip away. Women who see past the money and the power, they're rare. Trust me." Chris thought about Imani's smile, her steady presence, the way she'd held his hand without hesitation. "I don't want to burden her. She has her own life, and I'm dying, Jennifer." "What kind of person asks someone to sign up for that?" "The human kind," Jennifer said firmly. "Look, I don't know this Imani, but if she stayed with you through your diagnosis, if she's still checking in on you, then she's already decided you're worth it. Don't make that decision for her. Let her choose." "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise. You just weren't listening." She took another bite of food, then said casually, "I looked into Dr. Morrison while I was waiting for my food. He's apparently the best neurosurgeon in the Midwest. Published dozens of papers on glioblastoma treatment. If anyone can help you, it's him." "Jennifer, you don't have to." "Don't," she interrupted. "Don't tell me what I have to or don't have to do. I'm going to help you through this whether you like it or not. We're going to fight this thing together, and when you're too tired or too scared to keep fighting, I'm going to fight for you. That's what friends do." Chris felt his throat tighten. "I don't know how to let people take care of me." "Then learn," Jennifer said simply. "You've got time to learn. Not as much as we'd like, but enough. And Chris, you don't have to be strong all the time. You don't have to have all the answers. You're allowed to be scared and sad and angry. You're allowed to need people. I've spent my whole life believing that needing people was weakness. Then you spent your whole life wrong, she said bluntly. Needing people isn't weakness, Chris. It's being human. And you get to be human now. Maybe for the first time in a long time. After Jennifer left, promising to return tomorrow with breakfast and updates from Dr. Morrison's office, Chris found himself alone again in his penthouse. But it felt different now. Less empty. Less cold. He pulled out his phone and opened his text thread with Imani. You were right about coming home. And about calling someone. Jennifer, my assistant, but apparently also my friend, just left. She brought food and made me eat. I think I'm starting to understand what you meant about building a support system. He hesitated, then added. Thank you. For everything. For staying. For seeing me. For not letting me face this alone. I don't think I've properly expressed how much that means to me. He hit send before he could overthink it. 3 dots appeared almost immediately. She must have just woken up. I'm so glad you're not alone, Chris. And you don't have to thank me. I'm here because I want to be. How are you feeling? Physically, I mean. Chris considered the question. The headache was there, a dull throb at the base of his skull that never quite went away. The exhaustion was bone deep. But somehow, knowing what was wrong, having a name for it, it almost felt better than the months of uncertainty. Headaches manageable. Tired. But okay, I think. Better than I expected to be, anyway. Good. Make sure you're drinking water and resting. Your body needs both right now. When's your appointment with Dr. Morrison? Jennifer's working on that. Hopefully soon. I'll come with you if you want. To the appointment. It helps to have someone there to ask questions and take notes. Medical appointments can be overwhelming, especially with something like this. Chris stared at the text, overwhelmed by the casual offer. She barely knew him. She'd worked a double shift and would work another full shift tonight. And yet she was offering to take more time, to give more of herself, to be there for him. You don't have to do that. I know you're busy, and I've already taken up so much of your time. Chris. I want to be there. Stop trying to protect me from choosing to care about you. I'm a grown woman. I can make my own decisions. And I'm deciding to be there for you. Accept it. Chris found himself smiling despite everything. There was something about Imani's straightforward honesty, her refusal to let him push her away, that broke through his defenses. Okay. Thank you. I'd like that. Having you there. Good. Now I need to get ready for work. But Chris. You did good today. Telling Jennifer, coming home, letting people in, that took courage. Be proud of yourself. I'll try. Have a good shift. I'll text you on my break. Try to rest. There was that heart emoji again. Chris saved the message, then immediately felt ridiculous for doing so. He was a 45-year-old billionaire dying of brain cancer, and he was getting emotional over a text message emoji. But maybe that was okay. Maybe that was exactly what Imani and Jennifer had been trying to tell him. That being human, being vulnerable, allowing himself to feel things, maybe that was okay. Maybe that was even necessary. Chris walked to the windows overlooking the lake, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. Somewhere out there, Imani was getting ready for her shift, Jennifer was probably still researching treatment options, and the world kept spinning despite the fact that his had tilted on its axis. 12 to 18 months. Maybe less. 5% survival rate. The numbers were still terrifying. The diagnosis was still a death sentence. But somehow, knowing he wouldn't face it alone made it feel almost bearable. Almost. What would you do if someone offered to walk through your darkest days with you? Have you ever been surprised by who showed up when you needed them most? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing your stories. The next week passed in a blur of appointments and tests. Jennifer had somehow secured an appointment with Dr. Morrison for that Friday, just 3 days after Chris's diagnosis. The neurosurgeon was everything Dr. Okonkwo had promised: brilliant, thorough, and cautiously optimistic about surgery. The tumor is in a challenging location, Dr. Morrison explained, pointing to the MRI images on his screen. But it's operable. I won't lie to you, Mr. Bennett, this is a risky surgery. The posterior fossa contains critical structures, and there's always a risk of complications. But leaving the tumor untouched is certain death. Surgery gives you a fighting chance. Imani sat beside Chris, her hand in his, asking questions with the kind of medical knowledge that came from years of nursing. She'd kept her promise, showing up for the appointment despite having worked the night before, her scrubs traded for jeans and a soft blue sweater that made her eyes even more striking. "What's the timeline?" she asked. "I'd like to schedule surgery for next week," Dr. Morrison said. "The tumor is growing, and every day we wait is a day it gets larger. I know that's fast, but with glioblastoma, time is literally of the essence." Next week. Chris felt panic flutter in his chest. He'd known surgery was coming, but hearing an actual date made it terrifyingly real. "What's the recovery like?" Jennifer asked from her position by the window, laptop open, taking notes like she was in a business meeting. "He'll be in the ICU for at least 2 days post-op, then moved to a regular room for another 5 to 7 days. After that, we'll need to wait for the pathology results to confirm the diagnosis, then start planning radiation and chemotherapy." Dr. Morrison looked at Chris directly. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this, it's going to be brutal. Brain surgery is no joke, and the recovery is painful. But Mr. Bennett, you're relatively young and otherwise healthy. Those are factors in your favor." Relatively young. At 45, Chris supposed that was true. But he felt ancient, worn down by months of symptoms and the weight of his diagnosis. "Okay," Chris heard himself say. "Let's do it. Schedule the surgery." After the appointment, the three of them stood on the sidewalk outside Dr. Morrison's office building. The November wind whipped through the Chicago streets, carrying the first hints of winter. Chris pulled his coat tighter, suddenly cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. "I should get back to the office," Jennifer said reluctantly. "I've been out most of the afternoon, and there are some things I need to handle before the weekend. But Chris, I'm coming over tonight. We need to talk about what happens after surgery. Who's going to stay with you, medical power of attorney, all of it." "I can stay with him," Imani said. "After surgery, I mean. I've got vacation days saved up. I can take time off." Both Chris and Jennifer turned to stare at her. "Imani," Chris started. "You can't, that's too much to ask." "Good thing you're not asking then," Imani said calmly. "I'm offering. And before you argue, think about this. I'm a nurse. I know how to manage post-op care. I can monitor your vitals, manage your pain, watch for complications. You need someone with medical training to help you through recovery, and I'm volunteering." "But your job?" "I have 4 weeks of vacation saved up," Imani said. "And Chris, I want to do this. Please let me." Chris looked into her warm brown eyes and saw nothing but sincerity. No pity, no obligation, just genuine desire to help. To care for him. "Why?" he asked for what felt like the 100th time. "Why would you give up 4 weeks of your life for me?" Imani smiled softly. "Because sometimes, you meet someone at exactly the right moment. And you realize that being there for them isn't a sacrifice, it's a privilege. You're not a burden, Chris. You're a person worth caring about. When are you going to start believing that?" Jennifer was grinning now. "I like her," she announced. "Chris, if you don't keep this woman in your life, I'm going to be very disappointed in you." "I'm not trying to get rid of her," Chris protested. "I'm trying not to ruin her life." "My life isn't ruined," Imani said firmly. "My life is exactly where it's supposed to be. And right now, that's here. With you." Chris felt something warm bloom in his chest, pushing back against the fear and uncertainty. He reached for Imani's hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I don't think I'll ever be able to thank you enough, but thank you." You don't have to thank me, Imani said. Just let me be here. That's all I ask. Jennifer checked her watch. I really do have to run. Chris, I'll see you tonight. Imani, it was wonderful meeting you. Take care of our guy here. I will, Imani promised. After Jennifer left, Chris and Imani walked slowly down the street, neither quite ready to part ways. The afternoon sun painted the buildings in shades of gold, and for just a moment, Chris let himself forget about tumors and surgery and death sentences. For just a moment, he was simply a man walking down a Chicago street with a beautiful woman, feeling the warmth of her hand in his. Can I buy you coffee? He asked. Or lunch? Whatever you have time for. Imani checked her phone. I don't have to be at work until 7. So yes, you can buy me lunch. But Chris. Somewhere normal. Not some five-star place where they serve food I can't pronounce. I want a burger and fries from a place with sticky tables and too loud music. Chris laughed, actually laughed, for the first time since his diagnosis. I think I can manage that. They found a diner 3 blocks away, exactly the kind of place Imani had described. Red vinyl booths, a jukebox in the corner playing Motown classics, and a menu laminated in plastic. It was perfect. Over burgers and milkshakes, they talked about everything except cancer. Imani told him about growing up on the South Side, about her mother who'd worked 2 jobs to put her through nursing school, about her younger brother who was studying engineering at Illinois Tech. Mom's going to lose her mind when she finds out I'm taking a month off work, Imani said, stealing one of Chris's fries. She thinks I work too hard as it is. She's probably right, Chris said. How many hours do you usually work? Too many, Imani admitted. But I love it. There's something about being there for people when they're at their most vulnerable, you know? When they're scared and hurting and need someone to see them as human, not just a diagnosis. It's sacred work. Chris understood what she meant. That was what she'd done for him, seen him as human when he'd been hiding behind lies and fears. Treated him with dignity and compassion when he'd given her every reason not to. Your patients are lucky to have you, he said. I'm lucky to have them, Imani corrected. They teach me something new every day. About courage, about resilience, about what really matters. She paused, then said softly, You're teaching me too, Chris. What am I teaching you? That it's never too late to let people in. That vulnerability isn't weakness. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help. She reached across the table and took his hand. You think you're broken, but I see someone who's incredibly strong. Strong enough to face the scariest diagnosis there is. Strong enough to stop running and start fighting. Strong enough to let people care about you even when every instinct is telling you to push them away. Chris felt his eyes burn. I don't feel strong. I feel terrified. Being terrified and doing it anyway, that's the definition of courage, Imani said. And Chris, you're the most courageous person I know. They sat in that sticky-tabled diner, hands clasped across greasy plates, while the jukebox played and other customers laughed and talked around them. And for the first time since Dr. Okonkwo had spoken those terrible words, glioblastoma, terminal, 5%, Chris felt something other than fear. He felt grateful. Grateful for Imani's presence. For Jennifer's fierce loyalty. For this moment, this connection, this gift of being seen and cared for despite all his flaws and fears. Maybe that was what the end of life was supposed to teach you. Not how to die, but how to finally, truly live. The night before surgery, Chris couldn't sleep. He'd tried, lying in his king-sized bed in his silent penthouse, staring at the ceiling, counting backwards from 1,000. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Dr. Morrison's careful hands pointing to the MRI images, heard the measured way he'd explained the risks. Stroke. Paralysis. Loss of vision. Loss of speech. Infection. Bleeding. Death on the operating table. Any of those things could happen tomorrow. Or all of them. At 2 a.m., Chris gave up on sleep and went to his home office. If these were his last hours of coherent thought, of being fully himself before they cut into his brain, he needed to use them wisely. He pulled up his laptop and began to write. Not business documents or emails or strategic plans. Letters. To Jennifer, thanking her for 7 years of loyalty that had somehow become friendship. To Marcus in IT, to Keisha in marketing, to Tom in legal, all the people Jennifer had mentioned, people whose lives he'd touched without realizing it. People who'd cared about him when he'd thought no one did. And finally, because he couldn't not, he wrote to Imani. Dear Imani, I don't know how to write this letter. I've written thousands of emails, hundreds of business proposals, countless strategic plans. But trying to put into words what you've meant to me in the span of just 10 days, that feels impossible. You walked into my life at 2:47 a.m. on the worst night of my existence, and somehow, you made it bearable. You saw me when I was trying desperately to be invisible. You stayed when any reasonable person would have walked away. You held my hand through the darkest moments and promised me I wasn't alone. And you kept that promise. Every single day since, you've kept it. I don't know what tomorrow will bring. Dr. Morrison is brilliant, but brain surgery is brain surgery, and there are no guarantees. I might wake up different. I might not wake up at all. And if that happens, I need you to know something. Meeting you changed my life. In the time I have left, whether that's days or months or by some miracle, years, you've shown me what it means to truly connect with another human being. You've taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness, that asking for help isn't failure, that letting someone care about you is perhaps the bravest thing a person can do. You've given me something I didn't think existed anymore. Hope. Not hope for a cure or for survival, but hope that however long I have, it will be meaningful. That I won't die as Christopher Bennett, the isolated billionaire who built an empire but forgot to build a life. I'll die as Chris, a man who was lucky enough to be seen and loved by someone extraordinary. Because I do love you, Imani. I know it's too soon, that we've only known each other for 10 days, that I have no right to burden you with feelings when I'm quite literally dying. But if tomorrow goes wrong, if I don't get another chance to tell you, I need you to know, loving you has been the realest, truest thing I've done in years. You don't have to love me back. You don't have to feel anything except what you naturally feel. But I needed to say it. I needed to be honest, the way you've been teaching me to be. Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for staying. Thank you for showing me what it means to be human. Whatever happens tomorrow, know that you changed my life. You saved it, really, in all the ways that matter. With more gratitude than I can express, Chris. He read the letter 3 times, his finger hovering over the send button. It was too much, too honest, too vulnerable. Everything in him that had spent 15 years protecting himself screamed not to send it. But that man, the one who hid and protected and kept everyone at arm's length, he was dying. And Chris wanted the man who replaced him, the one Imani had helped him become, to be brave enough to speak his truth. He clicked send. Then he closed his laptop, walked to the windows overlooking the lake, and watched the city lights reflect off the water until the first hints of dawn painted the eastern sky. The pre-op area at Northwestern Memorial was bustling with controlled chaos. Nurses moved efficiently between curtained bays, checking vitals and starting IVs. Doctors made their rounds, reviewing charts and answering last-minute questions. And patients waited, some stoic, some terrified, all facing their own battles with flesh and bone and fate. Chris sat on the edge of his hospital bed in his gown, feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with the thin fabric. Jennifer sat in the chair to his left, her laptop abandoned for once, just being present. And Imani stood to his right, one hand on his shoulder, steady and warm. She'd arrived at 6 a.m. despite not needing to be there until noon for her shift. She'd brought real coffee, not the hospital swill, and had stayed close while the nurses did their prep work, answering Chris's nervous questions with the calm competence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked softly, her thumb tracing small circles on his shoulder blade. "A little," Chris lied. "You. Enough." She smiled, and he could see she knew he was lying. "Chris, I got your email." His heart stuttered. He'd sent it at 3 a.m., and then immediately regretted it, and then couldn't regret it because it was true, every word. Imani, you don't have to. I shouldn't have. Stop, she said gently. She crouched down so they were eye level, her brown eyes soft and shining. Don't take it back. Don't apologize for being honest with me. But it's too much, too soon. You don't have to feel. Chris. She took both his hands in hers. I read your letter 3 times. And then I cried. And then I read it again. And you want to know what I thought. He couldn't speak, could only nod. I thought, finally, this man is letting himself be fully seen. Finally, he's being brave enough to speak his truth, consequences be damned. She squeezed his hands. You asked if I love you back. And Chris, I don't know if it's love yet, it's only been 10 days. But it's something. Something real and honest and worth exploring. Something that makes me want to be here, makes me want to fight beside you, makes me believe that whatever time we have together matters. Even if it's not much time? Even then, she said firmly. Quality over quantity, remember? I'd rather have honest, real connection with you for however long we get than a lifetime of surface-level relationships that mean nothing. Chris felt tears slip down his cheeks, not caring who saw. I'm scared, he whispered. What if I wake up different? What if I can't speak or move or remember who I am? What if? Then we deal with it, Imani said. Together. Whatever happens in that operating room, whatever you wake up as, you're still you. Still worth caring about. Still deserving of love and dignity and every good thing. And I'll be here. I promise you, Chris. I'll be here. Jennifer cleared her throat, and they both looked over to find her wiping her eyes. Sorry, she said. Something in my eye. Several somethings. Possibly my entire emotional dam breaking. Despite everything, Chris laughed. Thank you for being here, Jennifer. Both of you. I don't think I could do this alone. Good thing you don't have to, Jennifer said. She stood and came to his other side, placing her hand on his free shoulder. We've got you, boss. Both of us. You're going to go in there, and Dr. Morrison is going to work his magic, and you're going to come back to us. And then the real fight begins. But you won't fight it alone. A nurse appeared at the curtain. Mr. Bennett? It's time. Dr. Morrison is ready for you. This was it. The moment everything changed. Chris looked between these two women, Jennifer, who'd transformed from employee to friend in the crucible of crisis, and Imani, who'd walked into his life and refused to leave even when staying was hard, and felt a surge of gratitude so intense it nearly overwhelmed him. Okay, he said. I'm ready. The nurse began to wheel his bed toward the oar, and Chris watched Jennifer and Imani follow as far as they were allowed. At the doors to the surgical suite, they had to stop. Chris craned his neck to keep them in sight as long as possible. I'll see you on the other side, he called out, trying to sound confident. You better, Jennifer called back, her voice thick with emotion. And Imani, his beautiful, brave Imani, simply pressed her hand to her heart and mouthed 3 words that Chris carried with him into the operating room, into unconsciousness, into the uncertain territory of surgery and survival. I'll be here. The surgery took 7 hours. Imani had gone to work for her shift, but she'd texted Jennifer updates every hour, asking for news. Jennifer had planted herself in the surgical waiting room with her laptop, ostensibly working but mostly just staring at the doors every time they opened, hoping for Dr. Morrison's face. Other families came and went. Some received good news, tearful reunions in the hallway. Others received news that sent them crumpling into chairs, holding each other while their worlds shattered. Jennifer watched them all, sending up silent prayers to a God she wasn't sure she believed in anymore but was willing to bargain with today. Please, she thought. Please let him be okay. Not for the company. Not for the stock price. For him. Because he deserves more time. Because he just learned how to live, and it's not fair to take that away now. At hour 5, Marcus from IT appeared with coffee. At hour 6, Keisha from marketing arrived with sandwiches no one ate. At hour 7, Tom from legal showed up straight from court, still in his suit, his face drawn with worry. "How is he?" Tom asked, pulling up a chair beside Jennifer. "Still in surgery," Jennifer said. "No news yet." "Jesus." Tom ran a hand through his graying hair. "I can't believe this is happening. He's invincible. He's always been invincible." "He's human," Jennifer said quietly. "He's just as human and fragile as the rest of us. He just hid it better." They sat together in the waiting room, for people brought together by their connection to a man who'd thought he was alone. For people who proved he never had been, he'd just been too afraid to look. At hour 7 and 43 minutes, Dr. Morrison finally appeared in the doorway, still in his surgical scrubs. Jennifer leaped to her feet, her heart in her throat. "He's alive," Dr. Morrison said immediately, and Jennifer felt her knees go weak with relief. "The surgery went well. We removed approximately 80% of the tumor, as much as we could safely access without damaging critical structures. He's being moved to the ICU now." "When can we see him?" Jennifer asked. "He'll be unconscious for several more hours as the anesthesia wears off. But once he's settled in the ICU, you can visit briefly. Just be prepared, he's going to look rough. Lots of tubes and monitors, significant swelling. It's always shocking to see someone post-brain surgery, even when everything goes right." "But it did go right," Jennifer pressed. "He's going to be okay?" Dr. Morrison's expression was carefully neutral. "He survived the surgery, which is the first hurdle. The next 48 hours are critical. We'll be watching for bleeding, swelling, infection. If he makes it through that, his prognosis improves significantly. But Ms. Park, I need to be honest with you. We got most of the tumor, but not all of it. Some of it was too entangled with vital structures to remove. He'll need radiation and chemotherapy, and even then, glioblastoma is notorious for recurring." "But he has a chance," Jennifer said. "That's what you're saying. He has a fighting chance." "Yes," Dr. Morrison agreed. "He has a chance. And Mr. Bennett seems like a fighter. That matters more than people realize." After Dr. Morrison left, Jennifer pulled out her phone with shaking hands and texted Imani. "Surgery's over. He's alive. In ICU now. Dr. Morrison says it went as well as could be expected. He's going to make it, Imani. Our guy is going to make it." Imani's response came immediately. "Thank God. I'm coming up as soon as my shift ends." "Is he awake?" "Not yet. Still under anesthesia. But we can see him soon. Tell him I'm coming. Tell him I kept my promise. I'm here." Jennifer smiled through her tears. "You hear that, Chris?" she whispered to the empty air. "Your girl's coming. She kept her promise. You better wake up and see her." Chris woke in increments, consciousness returning in confused fragments. Pain, dull and throbbing. Bright lights that hurt his eyes. Voices, distant and echoing. The steady beep of monitors. He tried to move, but his body felt weighted down, disconnected. Tried to speak, but his throat was raw and dry, something blocking his words. "Easy, Mr. Bennett." A nurse's face swam into view above him, not Imani, someone he didn't recognize. "You're in the ICU. You've just had surgery. Don't try to talk, you have a breathing tube. We'll remove it soon, but for now, just relax. Everything went well. Surgery. Brain surgery. The tumor." It all came flooding back, and Chris felt panic claw at his chest. He tried to raise his hand to his head, but restraints held him gently in place. "Your friends are here," the nurse said kindly. "They've been waiting for you. Would you like to see them?" Chris managed a small nod, and the nurse disappeared. Moments later, or maybe hours, time felt liquid and strange. Jennifer's face appeared above him, her eyes red-rimmed but smiling. "Hey boss," she said softly. "Welcome back. You scared the hell out of us." Chris tried to apologize, but the tube prevented speech. He must have looked distressed because Jennifer quickly took his hand. Don't try to talk. You're okay. The surgery went well. Dr. Morrison said he got most of the tumor. You're going to be fine, Chris. You're going to be just fine. Another face appeared beside Jennifer's, Imani, still in her scrubs, her hair pulled back, exhaustion evident in every line of her face. But when she looked at him, her smile was radiant. There you are, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I told you I'd be here. I kept my promise. Chris felt tears leak from the corners of his eyes. He wanted to tell her he loved her, wanted to thank her for staying, wanted to say all the things the breathing tube prevented. But Imani seemed to understand because she leaned down carefully, mindful of all the tubes and wires, and pressed her lips to his forehead. I know, she whispered. I know, Chris. I feel it too. Now rest. Let your body heal. We've got time, not as much as we'd like, but enough. And I'm going to be here for all of it. Every single moment. Chris closed his eyes, letting her words wash over him. The pain was there, significant and unavoidable. The fear was there too, lurking at the edges of his consciousness. But stronger than both was something else, something warm and hopeful and entirely new. He wasn't alone. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he genuinely wasn't alone. And that, Chris realized as sleep pulled him under again, was worth more than all the billions in his accounts. Worth more than his company or his empire or anything else he'd ever built. Connection. Love. People who stayed. That was the real treasure. And somehow, in the darkest chapter of his life, he'd finally found it. The next 3 days passed in a haze of pain medication and medical procedures. The breathing tube came out on day 2, leaving Chris's voice hoarse but functional. The arterial line came out on day 3. Gradually, the tubes and wires and monitors decreased until Chris could move without feeling like a marionette on strings. Imani was there for all of it. She'd officially taken her vacation time, and true to her word, she stayed. She helped him with the indignity of post-surgical care, the bedpans and sponge baths and complete loss of privacy that came with being helpless. She advocated for him with the nursing staff, translating medical jargon and making sure his pain was managed. She read to him when he couldn't focus on screens, talked to him when he needed distraction, and sat in comfortable silence when words were too much. And slowly, impossibly, Chris began to heal. On day 4, they moved him from the ICU to a regular room. On day 5, he stood for the first time, wobbly and weak but standing. On day 6, he walked 5 steps to the chair beside his bed, and Jennifer and Imani applauded like he'd won an Olympic medal. You're doing remarkably well, Dr. Morrison said during his daily check-in on day 7. Your incision is healing nicely, no signs of infection. Your neurological function is good, no deficits in speech, memory, or motor control. If you continue progressing like this, we can talk about discharge in the next few days. And then? Chris asked. His voice was still rough, but getting stronger. Then you go home, continue recovering for about 4 weeks, and we start radiation, Dr. Morrison said. 5 days a week for 6 weeks. After that, chemotherapy. It's going to be a long road, Mr. Bennett. But you're young, relatively healthy, and you have an excellent support system. Those factors significantly improve your chances. After Dr. Morrison left, Chris looked at Imani, who was curled up in the visitor's chair with a medical journal. She'd been reading voraciously about glioblastoma treatment, asking questions that even the doctors seemed impressed by. You don't have to stay for all of it, Chris said. The radiation, the chemo, that's months of treatment, Imani. I can't ask you to put your life on hold for that long. Imani looked up from her journal, one eyebrow raised. Are we really doing this again? The thing where you try to push me away for my own good. I'm trying to be realistic. You're trying to protect me from choosing you, Imani corrected. Chris, I know what I'm signing up for. I'm a nurse. I've seen cancer treatment up close. I know it's going to be hard and messy and sometimes ugly. And I'm still choosing to stay. When are you going to believe that you're worth it? I'm dying, Imani. Even if the treatment works, I'm still dying. Eventually. We're all dying eventually, she said calmly. That's the human condition. You just have a clearer timeline than most. But Chris, however long you have, 6 months, a year, 5 years, 50 years, I want to spend it with you. Not because I pity you. Not because I'm some kind of saint. But because in 10 days, you've become one of the most important people in my life. Because I care about you. Because She stopped, took a breath. Because I'm falling in love with you. And I don't want to miss a single moment of whatever time we have. Chris felt his breath catch. You're falling in love with me? Is that so surprising? Yes, he said honestly. I'm a billionaire with a terminal brain tumor who lied about his name and spent weeks hiding in a motel. That's not exactly prime boyfriend material. Imani laughed, the sound warm and genuine. No, you're a man who got scared and ran, which is deeply human. A man who's learning to be vulnerable, which is incredibly brave. A man who writes beautiful letters at 3 in the morning and cries when he's overwhelmed and lets people take care of him even though it terrifies you. That's the man I'm falling for, Chris. Not the billionaire. Not the CEO. You. Chris held out his hand, and Imani crossed the room to take it, settling on the edge of his bed. I don't deserve you, he said. Stop saying that. You deserve care and love just like everyone else. Your illness doesn't change that. If anything, it makes it more important. Life is short, Chris. Yours is just shorter than most. So let's not waste it. Let's be honest and real and make every moment count. Chris pulled her closer, carefully mindful of his still healing incision. I meant what I said in that letter. I love you, Imani Davis. It's crazy and too fast and probably foolish, but I do. I love you. I love you too, Imani whispered, and then she was kissing him, gentle and careful and sweet, a promise of more to come. When they broke apart, Chris was smiling despite the pain, despite the uncertainty, despite everything. Because Imani was right. Life was short. His was shorter than most. But it was also richer than it had ever been, full of real connection and honest emotion and a love he'd never expected to find. Thank you, he said softly. For seeing me. For staying. For loving me. Always, Imani promised. Through radiation and chemo and whatever comes after. I'm not going anywhere, Chris. You're stuck with me. I can't think of anywhere else I'd rather be stuck, Chris said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. Outside the hospital window, Chicago stretched out beneath a gray November sky. Somewhere out there, Bennett Technologies was running without him, the stock price fluctuating, board meetings happening, the world spinning on. And Chris found he didn't care. Not about the company, not about the empire, not about any of it. All that mattered was this moment, this woman, this love that had found him in the darkest hour and refused to let go. It wasn't a cure. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't going to save his life. But it had already saved something far more important, his soul. Have you ever found love in an unexpected place? Have you learned something profound during a difficult time? Share your experience in the comments. We'd love to hear how you found light in the darkness. 3 months later, Chris stood in front of the mirror in his penthouse bathroom, studying the angry red scar that curved across his scalp. His hair was growing back slowly, patchy and uneven, but the scar would always be there, a permanent reminder of the day they'd cut into his brain and tried to steal back time from death. The radiation treatments had ended 2 weeks ago. 30 sessions of lying perfectly still while invisible beams bombarded his skull, trying to kill whatever cancer cells Dr. Morrison hadn't been able to reach. The side effects had been brutal, exhaustion so profound that some days he couldn't get out of bed, headaches that made his pre-surgery pain seem trivial, nausea that made eating a Herculean task. But he'd survived it. And now, chemotherapy loomed on the horizon. 6 months of poison coursing through his veins, killing cancer cells and healthy cells alike in a desperate race to buy him more time. You're brooding again, Imani's voice came from the doorway. Chris turned to find her leaning against the frame, wearing one of his old MIT t-shirts and a pair of yoga pants, her hair wrapped in a silk scarf. She'd moved into the penthouse 6 weeks ago, after it became clear that Chris needed round-the-clock care and she wasn't willing to trust it to anyone else. Her presence had transformed the cold, sterile space. Plants now lined the windowsills, their green leaves reaching toward the light. Photographs covered the previously bare walls, pictures of them at the hospital, of Jennifer and the growing group from Bennett Technologies who'd become regular visitors, of Imani's family who'd embraced Chris with a warmth that still surprised him. "Just thinking," Chris said, about how different everything is. 3 months ago, I was hiding in a motel, convinced I was going to die alone. Now I'm here, with you, surrounded by people who actually care. It's surreal." Imani crossed the bathroom and wrapped her arms around him from behind, her chin resting on his shoulder as they both looked at their reflection. "Good different or bad different?" "Good," Chris said immediately. "Terrifying sometimes, but good. I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. For you to realize what you've signed up for and run." "Chris Bennett," Imani said firmly, "we've had this conversation approximately 600 times in the past 3 months. I'm not going anywhere. When are you going to believe me?" "Maybe after 601 conversations," Chris said, but he was smiling. The truth was, he did believe her. Somewhere in the exhausting grind of radiation treatments and doctor's appointments and the mundane daily realities of being sick, Chris had stopped waiting for Imani to leave. She'd proven herself over and over, holding his hair back when the nausea won, reading to him when the exhaustion was too great for screens, advocating fiercely with his medical team when his pain wasn't being managed properly. She'd also proven herself in the small moments, making him laugh when everything seemed dark, forcing him outside for short walks when all he wanted was to hide in bed, celebrating tiny victories like eating a full meal or going a day without vomiting. Imani had become his partner in the truest sense. Not just someone who stayed, but someone who fought beside him, who challenged him, who loved him in all his broken, scarred, imperfect humanity. "Come on," Imani said, tugging him toward the bedroom. "Jennifer and the crew are coming over for dinner in 2 hours, and you promised to help me cook." "I promised to sit on a stool and provide moral support while you cooked," Chris corrected. "Dr. Morrison said no sharp objects until my coordination fully returns." "Fine. You can chop vegetables under strict supervision." The dinner had been Jennifer's idea, a weekly gathering she'd dubbed family dinner, despite Chris's protests that it was too much work for Imani. But Imani had loved the idea, and so every Sunday evening, their penthouse filled with people. Tonight it was Jennifer and Marcus from IT, Keisha from marketing and her husband, Tom from legal and his teenage daughter, and Imani's mother, Grace, who'd appointed herself Chris's second caretaker despite his insistence that he didn't need one. "You need more than one," Grace had said flatly the first time she'd visited. "Because my daughter works herself to the bone taking care of everyone else, and someone needs to take care of her while she's taking care of you." Grace Davis was a force of nature, a retired schoolteacher with opinions about everything and the energy of someone half her 63 years. She'd taken one look at Chris's gaunt frame and immediately started showing up with Tupperware containers full of her cooking, refusing to leave until she'd watched him eat. "You need meat on those bones," she declared. "Can't fight cancer if you're wasting away." Now, Grace commanded Chris's kitchen like she'd been born in it, directing traffic while Imani and Jennifer set the table and the others gathered in the living room. "Mr. Chris," Grace called out, "come taste this gravy and tell me if it needs more salt." Chris obediently made his way to the stove, where Grace held out a spoon for him to taste. The rich, savory flavor exploded on his tongue. One of the few things that still tasted right after radiation had messed with his sense of taste. "It's perfect, Grace," he said honestly. "You say that about everything I make," she said, but she was smiling. "Because everything you make is perfect." "Flatterer." Grace swatted him gently with a dish towel. "Now go sit down before you fall down. You look exhausted." Chris was exhausted, bone-tired in a way that never seemed to fully lift, but he was also happy. Genuinely, surprisingly happy. His penthouse, which had once felt like a museum, now felt like a home. Filled with laughter and conversation and the smell of Grace's cooking. Filled with life. "You doing okay?" Jennifer asked quietly, appearing at his elbow as he made his way to the sofa. "Yeah," Chris said. "I really am." Jennifer studied his face, and whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she nodded. "Good. You look better than you did a month ago. Less like death warmed over." "Your bedside manner needs work," Chris said dryly. "Good thing I'm not a nurse." Jennifer glanced toward the kitchen, where Imani was laughing at something her mother had said. "She's good for you, you know." "Imani, I've never seen you this human." "I'm not sure that's a compliment." "It is," Jennifer said seriously. "You spent so many years being Christopher Bennett, tech god, that you forgot how to just be Chris. She reminds you. She makes you remember what matters." Before Chris could respond, Marcus called out from across the room. "Hey, Chris. We've been talking, and we think you should come back to the office. Part-time, nothing crazy. But the team misses you, man. It's not the same without you." Chris felt something warm bloom in his chest. He'd officially stepped back from his CEO duties 2 months ago, handing day-to-day operations to his COO while he focused on treatment. He'd expected relief, from the board, from shareholders, from everyone who'd been waiting for him to get out of the way. Instead, he'd received an outpouring of support that still stunned him. Cards and emails and visits from employees he'd barely known by name. People sharing stories of how he'd helped them, encouraged them, believed in them when no one else had. "I don't know," Chris said carefully. "Treatment starts again next month, and—" "Which is why we're suggesting part-time," Keisha interjected. "A few hours a week. Zoom meetings from home when you're not feeling up to coming in. Chris, you built that company. You deserve to be part of it, even if you can't run it full-time anymore. And honestly," Marcus added, "we could use your brain. No pun intended. The AI project is stuck, and you're the only one who really understands the architecture." Chris looked around at these people, employees who'd somehow become friends, who saw him as more than just a paycheck or a boss, who wanted him around not because they had to, but because they valued him. "Okay," he heard himself say. "Part-time. We'll see how it goes." The room erupted in cheers, and Chris found himself laughing, overwhelmed by their enthusiasm. Imani caught his eye from across the room and mouthed "proud of you," and Chris felt his heart swell. This was what Imani had meant, that day outside the hospital. This was what it meant to let people in, to build a support system, to accept that you were worth caring about. It wasn't just about having people around, it was about letting them matter, letting them care, letting yourself be vulnerable enough to need them. After dinner, after everyone had left and the dishes were cleaned and put away, Chris and Imani stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the lights of Chicago twinkle against the night sky. Imani was wrapped in Chris's arms, her back against his chest, and they swayed slightly to music only they could hear. "Today was good," Imani said softly. "Today was perfect," Chris corrected. "Thank you. For this. For them. For making this place feel like a home." "You did that," Imani said. "You let people in. That's all it took, just opening the door and letting them see you." Chris pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "I have something for you," he said. "I was going to wait, but I don't want to wait anymore. Life's too short for waiting." He released her and walked to his office, returning with a small velvet box. Imani's eyes widened as he opened it, revealing a ring, a simple platinum band with a single diamond, elegant and understated. "Chris," she breathed. "I know we haven't been together that long," Chris said, his voice steady despite the emotion coursing through him. "I know I'm sick, and the future is uncertain, and I have no right to ask you to legally bind yourself to someone who's dying. But Imani, you've given me the greatest gift of my life. You've shown me what it means to truly live. And however much time I have left, I want to spend it as your husband. If you'll have me." Imani's eyes were shining with tears. "Are you asking me to marry you?" I'm asking you to build a life with me, Chris said. Whatever that life looks like, however long it lasts. I'm asking you to be my partner, my wife, my everything. I love you, Imani. More than I thought I could love anyone. Will you marry me? For a moment, Imani just stared at him, tears streaming down her face. Then she launched herself at him, nearly knocking him over as she wrapped her arms around his neck. Yes, she said fiercely. Yes, yes, yes. 1,000 times yes. Chris slid the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, then pulled her close, kissing her with all the love and gratitude and desperate hope in his heart. When they broke apart, both were crying and laughing at the same time. I can't believe you proposed to me, Imani said, admiring the ring on her finger. I thought you were going to wait until you were in remission or something practical like that. I've spent too much of my life being practical, Chris said. I want to be impractical now. Reckless. I want to marry you as soon as possible and spend every moment of however long we have being ridiculously, impractically, in love. How soon is as soon as possible? How about next month? Before chemo starts. Something small, just family and close friends. Grace can make the food, we'll do it here with the city lights as our backdrop, and I'll marry the love of my life before my hair falls out again. Imani laughed through her tears. That's the most romantic proposal involving hair loss I've ever heard. Is that a yes? That's a yes, Imani confirmed. Next month. Small ceremony. Just the people who matter. Chris Bennett, you're going to be my husband. And you're going to be my wife, Chris said, wonder in his voice. Imani Bennett. I like the sound of that. Me too, Imani whispered, and kissed him again. The wedding took place 4 weeks later, in Chris's penthouse on a cold February afternoon. Snow fell softly outside the windows, turning Chicago into a winter wonderland. Inside, the living room had been transformed with white flowers and candles, simple but beautiful. There were only 20 people in attendance: Jennifer and Marcus, Keisha and Tom with their families, Imani's mother and brother, Dr. Okonkwo who'd started this whole journey, and a handful of others who'd become important to them both. Chris stood by the windows in a dark suit, his hair grown back enough to look almost normal, the scar on his scalp visible but no longer angry. He felt stronger than he had in months. The 4-week break between radiation and chemo had allowed his body to recover somewhat, and for the first time since diagnosis, he felt almost like himself. The music started, something soft and acoustic that Imani had chosen, and Chris turned to see her walking toward him. She wore a simple ivory dress that fell to her knees, her hair in natural curls around her shoulders, a small bouquet of white roses in her hands. She was the most beautiful thing Chris had ever seen. Not because of the dress or the flowers or the makeup, but because of the joy radiating from her face. The absolute certainty in her eyes. She wasn't walking toward a dying man. She was walking toward her future, whatever that future held. Grace walked beside her daughter, tears streaming down her face, and when they reached Chris, she pressed a kiss to his cheek and whispered, "You take care of my baby, you hear me?" "With my life," Chris promised, and meant it. The ceremony was brief but meaningful. They'd written their own vows, and when it was Chris's turn to speak, he took Imani's hands and said the words that had been in his heart since that first night in the ER. "Imani, you walked into my life when I was at my lowest. When I'd given up on connection, on love, on the possibility that anyone could see past my walls and find something worth caring about. And you didn't just see me, you stayed. Through diagnosis and surgery, through radiation and recovery, through every dark moment when I tried to push you away for your own good. You stayed. You taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness. That asking for help isn't failure. That letting someone love you is perhaps the bravest thing you can do. You taught me how to live, Imani. Really live. Not just exist, not just survive, but live with purpose and passion and connection. I can't promise you 50 years. I can't promise you a future without pain or fear or loss. But I can promise you this, however many days I have, they're yours. Every single one. I will love you with everything I am, for as long as I'm here. And even after that, my love for you will remain. Because what we have, it's bigger than time. It's bigger than illness. It's eternal. You're my miracle, Imani Davis. My second chance. My greatest gift. And I will spend the rest of my life being grateful that you walked into that ER at 2:47 a.m. and decided I was worth saving. By the time he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Imani was openly sobbing, and Chris had to wipe tears from his own cheeks before she could speak her vows. "Chris," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "when I became a nurse, I promised to care for people at their most vulnerable. To see them as human, not just as patients or diagnoses. To be present for them in their darkest moments. But I never expected to fall in love with someone I was caring for. I never expected to find my soulmate in a hospital at 3 in the morning. But that's exactly what happened. You came into my life broken and scared and trying desperately to be brave, and somehow, you became the most important person in my world. Not because I pity you. Not because I'm trying to save you. But because you're kind and honest and real in a way that most people never are. Because you make me laugh and challenge me to be better and love me with a fierceness that takes my breath away. I know the road ahead is hard. I know there will be days when the treatment makes you sick, when the fear is overwhelming, when the pain seems unbearable. But Chris, I also know this. I would rather have 1 year of real, honest, deep love with you than a lifetime of something safe and surface level with anyone else. You're worth it. We're worth it. And I promise you, through chemo and scans and whatever comes next, I'll be there. Not as your nurse, but as your wife. Your partner. Your love. Always." The officiant, a friend of Grace's from her church, smiled through her own tears as she pronounced them husband and wife. "Chris, you may kiss your bride." Chris cupped Imani's face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears, and kissed her softly. It was a kiss full of promise and hope and love so profound it felt like a physical force. When they broke apart, the small crowd erupted in applause and cheers. "Ladies and gentlemen," the officiant announced, "I present to you Mr. and Mrs. Christopher Bennett." The reception was exactly what they'd wanted. Small, intimate, filled with love and laughter. Grace's food was spectacular, the champagne flowed freely, and the conversation was easy and warm. Chris found himself standing by the windows again, watching his wedding reception unfold, and felt overwhelmed by how much had changed. 6 months ago, he'd been alone in a motel room, convinced he would die as he'd lived, isolated and afraid. Now he was married to the love of his life, surrounded by people who cared about him, facing the future with hope instead of despair. "You clean up nice, Mr. Bennett," Imani said, sliding her arms around his waist from behind. "So do you, Mrs. Bennett," Chris said, turning to face her. "How does it feel?" "Perfect," Imani said simply. "This. Us. All of it. Perfect. Even though I'm sick." "Especially because you're sick," Imani said firmly. "Because it means we're not taking a single moment for granted. We're not wasting time on stupid fights or keeping score or any of the nonsense that ruins most marriages. We know exactly how precious this is. That makes us lucky, Chris. Not cursed. Lucky." Chris pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her perfume, feeling the solid warmth of her body against his. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "I know," Imani said. "I love you too. More than I ever thought possible." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms while their friends and family celebrated around them. And Chris realized something profound. This was enough. This moment, this love, this life they were building together. Even if he only had months, even if the chemo failed and the cancer returned, this would be enough. Because he'd learned what really mattered. Not money or power or achievement. Not building empires or making billions. What mattered was connection. Love. Being seen and known and cherished by another human being. Having people who stayed, who fought beside you, who made ordinary moments extraordinary just by being present. That was the real wealth. That was what made life worth living. And Chris Bennett, who'd spent 15 years chasing the wrong things, had finally found it. 6 months later, Chris sat in Dr. Morrison's office, Imani's hand clasped tightly in his, waiting for the results of his latest MRI. The chemotherapy had been brutal, exactly as hard as everyone had warned it would be. He'd lost his hair again, lost more weight than was healthy, spent days too weak to get out of bed. There had been infections that required hospitalization, side effects that made him wish for death, moments so dark that even Imani's steadfast presence couldn't fully penetrate them. But he'd survived. 6 months of poison, and he was still here. Still breathing. Still fighting. Now came the moment of truth. Had it worked? Had they bought more time? Or had the cancer continued growing despite everything they'd thrown at it? Dr. Morrison entered the office, his face unreadable as he pulled up the MRI images. Chris felt his heart hammering against his ribs, each beat a prayer. Please. Please. Just a little more time. I have good news, Dr. Morrison said, and Chris felt Imani's grip on his hand tighten. The MRI shows no new tumor growth. In fact, the remaining tumor mass appears to have shrunk slightly. The treatment is working, Mr. Bennett. Chris couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what he was hearing. No new growth. Shrinking. Working. What does that mean? Imani asked, her voice shaking. Long-term, what does this mean? Dr. Morrison's expression was cautiously optimistic. It means we continue treatment. Another 6 months of chemo, then we scan again. If we can keep the tumor stable or shrinking, we could be looking at years instead of months. I'm not going to tell you you're cured. Glioblastoma is too aggressive for that kind of certainty. But Mr. Bennett, this is the best-case scenario. You're beating the odds. Years. Chris repeated, the word foreign on his tongue. You're saying I might have years? I'm saying you're responding exceptionally well to treatment. Your age, your overall health despite the cancer, your support system, all of those factors are working in your favor. So yes, with continued treatment and monitoring, years is a realistic hope. Chris turned to look at Imani and found her crying, her face radiant with joy. Years, she whispered. Chris, we have years. We have years, he repeated, and then he was crying too, pulling Imani into his arms while Dr. Morrison tactfully stepped out to give them privacy. They held each other and sobbed, not tears of grief or fear, but tears of relief and gratitude and overwhelming joy. Years. Not forever, maybe. Not a cure. But time. Precious, beautiful time to love and laugh and build a life together. We're going to have a future, Imani said through her tears. A real future. Chris, we can make plans. We can dream. We can live, Chris finished. Really live. Not just survive day to day, but live. Chris stood on the roof deck of his penthouse, the space that had once been barren and unused, now transformed into a garden. Planters lined the railings, filled with herbs and vegetables that Imani tended lovingly. String lights crisscrossed overhead, creating a canopy of warm light. And scattered throughout were mismatched chairs and tables, evidence of the many gatherings they'd hosted here. It was late summer, the air thick with humidity, the city spread out below them in a glittering carpet of lights. Chris had just finished his latest round of chemo, and while he was tired, he was also stronger than he'd been in months. The cancer was still there, it would probably always be there, lurking, waiting for an opportunity to grow again. But it was stable, controlled. Not winning. And Chris was living. God, he was living. Bennett Technologies was thriving under his part-time guidance, innovative and profitable and making a real difference in the world. He'd finally started using his wealth for something meaningful, funding cancer research, supporting nurse training programs in Imani's name, establishing scholarships for MIT students who reminded him of his younger self. His relationships had deepened and multiplied. Jennifer had become family, as close as any sister. Marcus and Keisha and Tom and countless others from the company checked in regularly, their concern genuine and their friendship real. Grace treated him like a son, still showing up with Tupperware and opinions about everything. And Imani, his wife, his partner, his everything. She continued to amaze him daily with her strength and love and unwavering commitment. They'd found their rhythm, learned to balance Chris's treatment with building an actual life together. They took trips when he felt well enough, nothing extravagant, just weekends away, new experiences, making memories. They hosted their Sunday dinners religiously, filling their home with laughter and love. They talked about the future, cautiously, but with real hope. They were happy. Despite the cancer, despite the uncertainty, despite everything, they were genuinely, surprisingly happy. "There you are," Imani's voice came from behind him. She emerged onto the roof carrying 2 glasses of lemonade, her sundress flowing around her legs. Grace called. "She's making her famous peach cobbler for Sunday dinner, and she wanted to make sure you'd be feeling up to eating." "I'll make room," Chris promised, accepting the lemonade. "Even if I have to skip everything else." Imani laughed and settled into the chair beside him, curling her legs up beneath her. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the city lights flicker and dance. "Do you ever think about that night?" Imani asked. "When you first came to the ER?" "All the time," Chris admitted. "I think about how close I came to not going. To dying alone in that motel room because I was too proud or too scared to ask for help." "I think about it too," Imani said softly. "I almost didn't take that double shift. My supervisor asked, and I was exhausted, but something made me say yes. And then you walked in, and everything changed." "You think it was fate?" Chris asked. "That we were meant to meet?" "I think we were lucky," Imani said. "Lucky that our paths crossed at exactly the right moment. Lucky that we were both brave enough to take the risk. Lucky that we chose each other, even when choosing was scary and uncertain." Chris reached for her hand, threading their fingers together. "I'm the lucky one. You saved my life, Imani. Not just physically, but in every way that matters." "You saved mine too," Imani said. "You taught me that taking care of myself isn't selfish. That my worth isn't measured by how much I sacrifice. That I deserve love and partnership, not just being needed." "We saved each other, Chris. That's how it works." She was right. They'd saved each other. 2 broken people who'd found wholeness in their brokenness, who'd built something beautiful from fear and pain and the courage to be vulnerable. "I need to tell you something," Chris said, his heart suddenly racing. Imani turned to look at him, concern in her eyes. "What is it? Are you feeling okay?" "I'm fine," Chris assured her. "Better than fine. I've been thinking about the future. About what we want. And Imani, I know we said we weren't going to make big plans until we knew more about my prognosis. But the latest scans were good. Dr. Morrison thinks I could have years. And I don't want to waste those years waiting for permission to dream." "Okay," Imani said carefully. "What are you saying?" Chris took a deep breath. "I'm saying I want to expand our family. Not right now, we'd need to talk to Dr. Morrison about timing, and I know the chemo complicates things. But in the future, when I'm stronger, I want kids, Imani. With you. I want to build a life that's about more than just surviving cancer. I want a life that's full and messy and real." Imani's eyes filled with tears, the happy kind. "You want to have children? Even with the cancer," Chris confirmed. "Even with the uncertainty. Maybe especially because of those things. Because life is precious and short and meant to be lived fully, not cautiously. I love you, Imani Bennett. And I want to build something extraordinary with you. If you want that too." "I want that," Imani whispered. "God, Chris, I want that so much. A family. A future. All of it." They kissed as the city lights twinkled below them and the summer breeze carried the scent of Imani's herbs. And Chris felt something he'd never expected to feel again. Hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope of someone trying to outrun death. But the solid, steady hope of someone who'd learned that life was worth living, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. Because the hard parts were what made you human. The vulnerability was what created connection. The fear was what made courage possible. And love, real, honest, deep love, that was what made everything else worth it. The beach house on Lake Michigan was small but perfect. 2 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, and direct access to the water. Chris and Imani had bought it 2 years ago, a place to escape the city, to find peace when treatment got overwhelming, to build memories that had nothing to do with hospitals or cancer. Now, Chris sat on that porch in the early morning light, a mug of coffee warming his hands, watching the sun paint the water in shades of pink and gold. Behind him, he could hear Imani moving around the kitchen, and the higher-pitched voice of their daughter, Zoe, asking 1,000 questions about breakfast. Zoe, their miracle. Born 3 years after Chris's diagnosis, during a blessed period when his cancer was in remission and his body was strong enough to be a father. She had Chris's gray eyes and Imani's smile, and she'd transformed their lives in ways Chris couldn't have imagined. The cancer had returned twice in the 5 years since diagnosis. Each time, they'd fought it back with surgery or radiation or chemo. Each time, Chris had survived when the statistics said he shouldn't. He wasn't cured, would probably never be cured, but he was alive. Still here. Still fighting. And more importantly, he was living. Really, truly living. Daddy! Zoe burst onto the porch in her pajamas, her curly hair wild around her face. Mama says you have to eat breakfast with us. And then we're going swimming. Swimming sounds perfect, sweetheart, Chris said, pulling her into his lap. She was getting too big for this, nearly 4 years old and all energy and questions and boundless love, but he held her anyway, breathing in the little kid smell of her, memorizing this moment. Because that was what he'd learned. You had to memorize the moments. Had to be present for them. Had to soak them in and hold them close because life was fragile and time was precious and you never knew which moment might be your last. Imani appeared in the doorway, her hands on her hips but her eyes soft. Are you going to sit out here brooding, or are you going to come eat the pancakes your daughter insisted we make for you? Pancakes, Chris said, standing with Zoe in his arms. Definitely pancakes. They ate breakfast together on the porch, Chris and Imani and Zoe, plus Grace who'd driven up from the city to spend the weekend. They talked and laughed and Zoe spilled syrup all over herself, and it was perfect. Perfectly ordinary and perfectly extraordinary all at once. After breakfast, while Imani helped Zoe into her swimsuit, Grace pulled Chris aside. You look good, she said, studying his face. Healthy. Happy. I am, Chris said honestly. Both of those things. The cancer. Stable, Chris said. For now. We scan again next month, but Dr. Morrison is optimistic. I've beaten the odds, Grace. I'm not supposed to be here, and yet here I am. Grace's eyes filled with tears. You're here because you have something to live for. That makes all the difference. She was right. Having something to live for, someone to live for, it changed everything. It gave him a reason to fight through the brutal treatment, to keep going when giving up would have been easier, to choose hope even when fear screamed louder. Thank you, Chris said quietly. For accepting me. For loving me like family even when I was just some sick stranger your daughter brought home. You were never a stranger, Grace said firmly. From the moment Imani told me about you, I knew you were special. I knew you were going to be important. And Chris, you've been so good for my baby. You've given her the kind of love she deserves. That's all a mother can ask for. That afternoon, Chris and Imani walked along the beach while Grace watched Zoe build sandcastles. The water was cold but refreshing, and Chris let it wash over his feet, grounding him in this moment. Do you ever regret it? Imani asked suddenly. Marrying me. Having Zoe. Building this life when you knew, when we both knew, the time might be limited. Chris stopped walking and turned to face her. Never, he said fiercely. Not once. Not for a single second. Imani, this life we've built, it's everything. Even if I died the day after we got married, it would have been worth it. But I didn't die. I'm still here. And every day I get with you and Zoe, Every morning I wake up and see your face, every moment I get to be a husband and a father, that's a gift. The greatest gift I've ever received. Even with the cancer. Even with all the treatment, and the pain, and the fear. Especially with all of that, Chris said. Because the cancer taught me what matters. It stripped away all the bullshit, the money, the power, the pretense, and showed me what was real. You're real, Imani. Our family is real. This love we share is real. Everything else is just noise. Imani stepped closer, wrapping her arms around him. I love you so much. More than I ever thought I could love anyone. I love you too, Chris murmured into her hair. Thank you for taking a chance on me. For staying when staying was hard. For building this beautiful life with me. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms while the waves lapped at their feet and the sun warmed their skin. And Chris felt it again, that overwhelming sense of gratitude that had become as familiar as breathing. Gratitude for this day, this moment, this love. Gratitude for a second chance he'd never expected. Gratitude for a woman who'd walked into his life at exactly the right moment and refused to leave. Gratitude for a daughter who'd made him a father when he'd thought that dream was dead. Gratitude for all of it, the good and the bad, the joyful and the painful, the miraculous and the mundane. Because that was life. Not the carefully curated, Instagram-perfect version. But the real, messy, complicated, beautiful version. The version where you fought cancer and fell in love. Where you survived against the odds and built a family anyway. Where you learned that vulnerability was strength and asking for help was courage and letting people see you, really see you, was the bravest thing you could do. Come on, Imani said, pulling back to look at him. Let's go play with our daughter. She's probably convinced Grace to help her build a sand palace by now. They walked back up the beach hand in hand, and Chris watched Zoe's face light up when she saw them coming. Daddy! Mama! Look what Grandma Grace and I made. The sandcastle was lopsided and already crumbling, but Zoe looked at it like it was the Taj Mahal. Chris crouched down beside her, helping her shore up the walls, listening to her chatter about the princess who lived there and the dragon who protected it. This was it, Chris realized. This was what he'd been hiding from in that motel room 18 months ago. Not death, everyone died eventually. But life. Real, messy, vulnerable life. The kind where you opened yourself up to love and loss, to joy and pain, to all the things that made you human. He'd been so afraid of dying alone that he'd almost missed the chance to truly live. But Imani had saved him. Not from the cancer, that was still there, still lurking, still a threat. But from the isolation. From the fear. From the walls he'd built so carefully that they'd become a prison. She'd shown him that real care, the kind that saw you at your worst and chose to stay anyway, could change everything. That love wasn't about perfection or permanence. It was about showing up. Being present. Choosing each other, again and again, even when choosing was hard. That evening, after Zoe was asleep and Grace had retired to her room, Chris and Imani sat on the porch swing, wrapped in a blanket against the cooling night air. The stars were brilliant overhead, untouched by city lights, and the sound of waves provided a gentle soundtrack. Tell me a story, Imani said, her head on Chris's shoulder. What kind of story? A happy one. About the future. About us. Chris smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. Okay. In this story, my next scan is clear. And the one after that. The cancer stays stable for years. Maybe forever. We watch Zoe grow up. She's brilliant and kind, just like her mother. She goes to college, falls in love, makes us grandparents someday. I like this story, Imani murmured. We grow old together, Chris continued. Gray hair and wrinkles and all the signs of a life well lived. We still have Sunday dinners with Jennifer and the crew. Grace is still cooking, still bossing us around, still the matriarch of our chosen family. And we're happy. Not perfectly happy. Life is still complicated and hard sometimes. But genuinely, deeply happy. What else? Imani asked. We travel. All the places we've talked about but haven't gotten to yet. Italy and Japan and New Zealand. We show Zoe the world, teach her that life is meant to be experienced, not just observed. And we keep this house, our sanctuary by the lake, and we come here whenever the world gets too loud. We make love and laugh and grow old in all the ways that matter. And the cancer? The cancer becomes something I had, not something I have, Chris said. A chapter in our story, but not the whole book. We don't forget it, how could we? It taught us too much. But we don't let it define us either. We're more than the illness. We're more than the treatment. We're Chris and Imani Bennett, and we built something extraordinary from the ashes of what should have destroyed us. Imani was crying now, soft tears that wet Chris's shirt. That's a beautiful story. It's our story, Chris said. Or at least, it's the story I'm choosing to believe. Maybe I'm being naive. Maybe the cancer will come back worse next time. Maybe the treatment will stop working. But Imani, I've spent 5 years preparing for the worst. Tonight, I want to hope for the best. Then that's what we'll do, Imani said, lifting her head to look at him. Her face was beautiful in the starlight, and Chris felt his heart swell with love. We'll hope for the best. We'll plan for a future. And whatever actually happens, we'll face it together. Just like we always have. Just like we always will, Chris promised. They kissed under the stars, wrapped in each other and the blanket and the love they'd built from unlikely beginnings. And Chris thought about that night 5 years ago, walking into St. Catherine's ER at 2:47 a.m., terrified and alone, ready to finally face what he'd been running from. He'd expected a diagnosis. A death sentence. The beginning of the end. But what he'd found instead was Imani. And through her, he'd found hope. Connection. Love. Life. The cancer had been real. The pain had been real. The fear had been real. But so was this. The love was real. The family was real. The life they'd built was real. And that, Chris had learned, was what mattered most. Not how long you lived, but how well you lived. Not avoiding vulnerability, but embracing it. Not hiding from connection, but running toward it with open arms. He'd been an undercover billionaire hiding a terminal diagnosis, convinced he had to face death alone to protect himself from pain. But a nurse had shown him real care. Had seen past his defenses to the scared, lonely man underneath. Had stayed when leaving would have been easier. Had loved him when loving him came with an expiration date. And that care, that love, that choice to stay, it had changed everything. Not the diagnosis. Not the prognosis. Not the medical reality of glioblastoma. But everything that actually mattered. Chris Bennett was still sick. Would probably always be sick to some degree. The cancer might return. The treatment might fail. He might not get the decades he wanted with Imani and Zoe. But he had today. And tomorrow. And right now, wrapped in his wife's arms under a canopy of stars, that was more than enough. That was everything. The lecture hall at MIT was packed with students, young, bright, hungry for knowledge and success. Chris stood at the podium, older now, grayer, the scar on his scalp barely visible beneath his hair. But alive. Still here. Still fighting. He'd been cancer-free for 3 years. 3 years since the last clear scan, since Dr. Morrison had cautiously used the word remission. It might not last. Glioblastoma was notorious for recurrence, but for now, Chris was healthy, strong, living without the sword of Damocles hanging quite so close over his head. "Thank you for having me today," Chris said, looking out at the sea of faces. "I know you were expecting a lecture about tech entrepreneurship or building unicorn companies. And we'll get to that. But first, I want to tell you a different kind of story." He clicked to the first slide, a photo of himself 10 years ago, gaunt and bald from chemo, but smiling. Imani was beside him, her arm around his shoulders, love evident in every line of her body. 10 years ago, I was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. The doctors gave me 12 to 18 months to live. and I spent the first 6 months of my symptoms hiding, from the diagnosis, from my life, from everyone who might have cared. Because I'd spent 15 years building an empire, and I'd convinced myself that needing people was weakness, that vulnerability was failure, that I had to face everything alone to be strong. He clicked to the next slide, the outside of St. Catherine's Medical Center. But then I walked into an emergency room at 2:47 in the morning, terrified and alone. And I met a nurse named Imani Davis. She stayed with me through my diagnosis, held my hand while they told me I was dying, promised me I didn't have to face it alone. And she kept that promise. Every single day since, she's kept it. The students were rapt, leaning forward in their seats. Chris clicked through more slides, his wedding to Imani, Zoe as a baby, family dinners with Jennifer and Grace, and all the people who'd become his chosen family. Here's what I learned in those dark months and years that followed, Chris said. Success isn't measured in dollars or valuations or exits. It's measured in connections. In the people who stay when staying is hard. In the love you build and the lives you touch and the vulnerability you're brave enough to show. I built Bennett Technologies from nothing, and I'm proud of that. But it's not my greatest achievement. My greatest achievement is the family I built. The relationships I nurtured. The courage I found to ask for help when I needed it. The wisdom to accept love when it was offered. He paused, letting his words sink in. You're going to graduate from this incredible institution, and many of you will go on to build amazing things. Companies and products and innovations that change the world. And that's wonderful. The world needs your brilliance. But here's what I want you to remember. Don't wait until you're dying to learn how to live. Don't build empires at the expense of relationships. Don't convince yourself that needing people makes you weak. The strongest thing I ever did wasn't building a billion-dollar company. It was walking into that hospital and admitting I needed help. It was letting Imani love me when loving me meant signing up for pain and loss. It was choosing to be vulnerable, even when every instinct told me to hide. Chris clicked to the final slide, a photo from last month. Him and Imani and Zoe, now 9 years old and full of sass and questions. They were at the beach house, all three of them laughing at something off camera, the love between them palpable even in a still image. This is what success looks like to me now, Chris said. Not the company. Not the wealth. But this. Family. Love. Connection. People who see you and stay. That's the real treasure. And it's available to all of you right now, if you're brave enough to reach for it. The lecture hall was silent for a moment after he finished. Then someone started clapping. And then everyone was on their feet, applauding, some with tears in their eyes. After the lecture, students lined up to talk to him. To share their own stories of illness or loss or fear. To thank him for his honesty. To tell him he'd changed how they thought about success. And Chris listened to each one, really listened, the way Imani had taught him. Because this, connecting with people, being vulnerable, sharing his story, this was what mattered now. Later that evening, Chris returned to his hotel room to find a text from Imani waiting. Zoe's science project won first place. She's so proud. Also, I love you. And I'm proud of you for sharing your story today. You're making a difference, Chris. Not just in boardrooms, but in hearts. That's what real success looks like. Chris smiled, his own heart full to bursting. He called home, and Zoe answered on the first ring, talking a mile a minute about her project on solar energy and how she wanted to be a scientist like her dad used to be. I'm not a scientist, sweetheart, Chris said. I'm an entrepreneur. Same thing, Zoe declared with 9-year-old certainty. You both solve problems. Mama says solving problems is the most important job in the world. Your mama is very wise, Chris said. I know, Zoe said matter-of-factly. Then, Daddy, when are you coming home? I miss you. Tomorrow afternoon, Chris promised. And then we're going to celebrate your first place win properly. Ice cream for dinner. Mama won't let us have ice cream for dinner. "We'll see about that," Chris said, and was rewarded with Zoe's delighted giggle. After they hung up, Chris sat in his quiet hotel room and thought about the long journey that had brought him here. From that motel room to the ER to surgery to treatment to remission. From isolation to connection. From hiding to vulnerability. From existing to living. It hadn't been easy. There had been setbacks and scares, moments when the cancer returned and they'd had to fight all over again. Times when Chris had been so sick he'd wished for death. Days when the fear was so overwhelming he couldn't breathe. But there had also been joy. So much joy. Marrying Imani. Becoming a father. Watching his company thrive under shared leadership. Building genuine friendships. Learning what it meant to be part of a community, a family, a love that transcended circumstances. The cancer had taken things from him. Time, health, the illusion of invincibility. But it had also given him things he'd never had before. Perspective. Gratitude. The ability to see what truly mattered. The courage to be vulnerable. The wisdom to accept help. The grace to love and be loved without walls or conditions. He pulled out his phone and texted Imani back. "I love you too. More than I can ever adequately express. Thank you for 10 years of showing me what real care looks like. Thank you for staying. Thank you for choosing me every single day. You saved my life, Imani. In every way a person can be saved." Her response came quickly. "You saved mine too. We saved each other." That's how it works when you love someone. You both become better, stronger, more whole. Now stop being sentimental and get some sleep. You have a plane to catch tomorrow, and a daughter who's counting down the hours until you're home. Chris smiled, set his phone aside, and prepared for bed. Tomorrow he'd fly home. He'd sweep Zoe into his arms and spin her around while she shrieked with delight. He'd kiss his wife and help make dinner and listen to stories about school and science projects and all the ordinary, extraordinary moments that made up their life. And he'd be grateful. For every single second. For every breath. For every moment he got with the people he loved. Because that was what the cancer had taught him, in the end. Not how to die but how to live. Really, truly, deeply live. And Chris Bennett, former undercover billionaire, terminal cancer patient turned long-term survivor, husband and father and human being, he was living now. Fully. Authentically. Without walls or masks or pretense. He was living the life Imani had shown him was possible that night in the ER when she'd held his hand and promised he wasn't alone. The life where real care changed everything. The life where love was the greatest treasure. The life worth fighting for. What's your greatest treasure in life? Have you ever had someone show you real care that changed your perspective? We'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear that they're not alone. Because that's the message at the heart of this story. No matter how dark things get, you don't have to face them alone. Real care, real love, real connection, that's what saves us. That's what makes life worth living. Thank you for joining us on Chris and Imani's journey. Until next time, remember, it's never too late to let people in. It's never too late to choose love. It's never too late to truly live.